St. Mary Mead, where peace is a fragile illusion. When a murder is announced, before it happens, the quiet village erupts. But the first victim isn't who anyone expects. And the killer? They're hiding in plain sight, weaving a web of stolen identities, decades-old secrets, and a fortune built on lies. Everyone has something to hide. Everyone is a suspect. Can one observant old lady untangle the truth before the shadows claim another life? Or is the most dangerous secret the one she's about to uncover? ...
Chapter 1. The Chilling Announcement. The September sun, warm and benevolent, dappled through the leaves of Miss Jane Marple's rose bushes, casting shifting patterns on the worn flagstones of her St. Mary Mead garden. It was the kind of afternoon that whispered of eternal peace, of jam-making and quiet cups of tea, of lives untouched by the sharper edges of the world. Miss Marple, her fingers stained faintly green from snipping away aphid-ridden leaves, paused to admire a particularly fine bloom of peace. A faint breeze, carrying the scent of damp earth and late-blooming honeysuckle, ruffled the white lace collar of her best gardening dress. It was, she reflected, a perfect, unremarkable Tuesday. Across the lane, in the bustling heart of the village, the tranquility was being punctured by the rhythmic thwack of Mrs. Price Ridley's tennis racket against a practice ball, and the cheerful clang of the post office doorbell. Inside the post office, a small, neatly printed notice had been blue-tacked to the counter, its stark black letters seeming to absorb the cheerful light. A murder will take place this Friday at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. Friends, please accept this, your only intimation. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, flushed and perspiring slightly from her exertions, who discovered it first. She'd popped in for a stamp and some woolly thoughts about the upcoming harvest festival. Her eyes scanned the notice, blinked, scanned again. A murder? Here? At Little Paddocks? The home of that quiet, respectable Miss Blacklock? It was absurd, utterly preposterous. "Good heavens, Mrs. Hartnell," she exclaimed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of conversation. "Have you seen this? Some ghastly joke, I presume, in terribly poor taste." Mrs. Hartnell, the postmistress, peered over her spectacles, her plump face puckered with disapproval. Indeed, Mrs. Price Ridley appeared this morning tucked under the glass. No name, nothing. Dreadful, simply dreadful. What is the world coming to? News, like ink in water, spreads with astonishing speed in St. Mary Mead. Within the hour, the notice was the sole topic of conversation at the tea shop, where Mrs. Price Ridley held forth with horrified relish. "It's an outrage! Imagine, advertising murder like it's a jumble sale. Poor Miss Blacklock will be horrified, utterly horrified." Mr. Pye, the fastidious bank clerk, sipped his Earl Grey. "Perhaps it's a publicity stunt for that new detective novel everyone's talking about, though why choose Little Paddocks?" "Or a hoax by those dreadful Simmons cousins," suggested Mrs. Carpenter, the vicar's wife, adjusting her hat. "They're always up to some silly prank. Remember the frog and the collection plate?" Miss Marple, having finished her gardening and changed into a fresh blouse and cardigan, adventured out for her customary walk. She drifted into the tea shop, drawn by the unusual buzz of excitement. Ordering a pot of China tea and a scone, she listened with an air of mild grandmotherly interest, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She absorbed the fragments, the notice, the location, the time, the universal shock and disbelief. "A murder," she murmured gently to Mrs. Carpenter, who was seated nearby. "Oh, Jane, it's monstrous. The police ought to be informed immediately. Inspector Craddock will have a fit." Miss Marple's blue eyes, usually soft and slightly unfocused, sharpened almost imperceptibly. "The police, for a notice in a post office, it seems premature, unless there's more to it." "More? What more could there be?" Mrs. Price Ridley leaned in, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "It's either a tasteless joke or the ravings of a lunatic. Though," she added, a speculative gleam in her eye, "one does wonder about Miss Blacklock's past. So very quiet. And those lodgers, that odd little foreign maid, Mitzi, and young Patrick Simmons and his sister Julia staying there. One hears whispers." Miss Marple said nothing, merely sipped her tea. She knew Miss Blacklock by sight, a capable, kind-faced woman who ran the Women's Institute with quiet efficiency. She knew the Simmons cousins were distant relations, recently arrived and seemingly harmless. Mitzi was a refugee, prone to theatrical tears. Whispers? St. Mary Mead thrives on them, but they rarely held substance. Yet the specificity of the notice nagged her. A murder will take place? At 6:30 p.m.? Friends, please accept this. It wasn't the language of a random prankster. It felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Her walk took her past the vicarage, where the vicar himself, the Reverend Leonard Clement, was wrestling with a stubborn rosebush near his gate. He looked up, wiping his brow, his normally placid face troubled. "Ah, Miss Marple. Dreadful business, this notice. Quite unsettling the parishioners. Mrs. Price Ridley is practically apoplectic." "Indeed, Vicar. Have you seen it?" "Saw it myself, bold as brass. I've telephoned Inspector Craddock, of course. He's coming down tomorrow to speak to Miss Blacklock. Seems the sensible thing to do, though I suspect he'll find it's just some idiot's idea of humor." He sighed, tugging at a thorny stem. "Still, it casts a pall, doesn't it, on a lovely day like this?" Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It does, rather. One hopes Miss Blacklock isn't too distressed." "Oh, she's made of stern stuff, is Letitia Blacklock," he assured her, "though I dare say she could do without this excitement." He paused, lowering his voice. "Between ourselves, I gather there was some financial difficulty hinted at, something about investments? But that's just village talk, probably nothing." Financial difficulty? Miss Marple stored the tidbit away. Motive, perhaps? Or just another whisper. She continued her walk, her path inevitably leading her towards the outskirts of the village where Little Paddocks stood. It was a pleasant, slightly shabby Victorian house, its garden neat but unremarkable. As she drew near, she saw Miss Blacklock herself in the front garden, deadheading roses with vigorous, almost angry strokes. Beside her, a young woman with striking red hair. Miss Marple recognized her as Philippa Himes, who did odd jobs locally, was pruning a wayward clematis. Miss Marple paused, feigning interest in a particularly fine hydrangea on the verge. She could hear snippets of their conversation carried on the still air. "Absolutely ridiculous, Philippa." Miss Blacklock's voice was tight with controlled fury. "The police coming tomorrow, as if I haven't enough to worry about. And Mitzi is in hysterics, convinced it's some plot against her. Honestly." "Perhaps it's just a silly joke, Miss Blacklock," Philippa suggested, her voice calm. "Though in very poor taste." "Joke? Who would joke about murder? And why here? It's malicious, that's what it is, designed to frighten, to disrupt." She straightened up, rubbing her lower back, her gaze sweeping the road. For a fleeting second, her eyes met Miss Marple's. There was a flicker of something there, not just annoyance, but a deeper, more profound unease, quickly masked by a polite, strained smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Enjoying the sunshine?"
"Indeed, Miss Blacklock. Your roses are looking particularly fine this year," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "Though I couldn't help but hear there seems to be some excitement." Miss Blacklock's smile tightened. "Oh, just some foolishness posted in the village. A prank, I'm sure. Nothing to concern yourself with." She turned back to her roses, a clear dismissal. Philippa Himes gave Miss Marple a brief, unreadable look before focusing intently on her pruning. Miss Marple murmured a farewell and continued her walk, her mind whirring. Miss Blacklock's reaction hadn't been simple annoyance. It had been fear, tightly leashed. And Philippa Hames, her calm seemed almost studied, a shield against something. As she rounded the bend, she nearly collided with Dolly Bantry, her oldest and dearest friend, bustling towards her, cheeks flushed, eyes sparkling with the thrill of the news. "Jane! Jane! Have you heard? It's all over the village! A murder! Announced! At Little Paddocks! Isn't it the most ghastly thing? And the most fascinating?" Dolly Bantry thrived on excitement. The more dramatic, the better. Miss Marple allowed herself to be steered towards a convenient bench overlooking the village green. "I have heard, Dolly. Most disturbing." "Disturbing? It's positively gripping." Dolly sat down, fanning herself with her gloves. "Everyone's talking. Mrs. Price Ridley is convinced it's those Simmons boys, Patrick and Edmund Swettenham, up to some game, though Edmund's usually buried in his poetry, poor lamb. Young Patrick is a bit wild, I suppose, and Julia Simmons is quite the hoyden. But murder? Even as a joke?" Miss Marple considered this. Patrick Simmons, she recalled, had a reputation for fast cars and faster living, though he'd been quiet since arriving at Little Paddocks. His sister Julia was quieter, studious. Edmund Swettenham, the lodger, was a moody intellectual, often seen scribbling in notebooks, hardly the type for public pranks. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said slowly, "it is not a joke at all." Dolly stared. "Not a joke? What else could it be? Someone actually planning to commit murder and advertising it? That's insane!" "Is it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "It ensures an audience, Dolly, creates confusion, provides cover. Think of the chaos at 6:30 p.m. Lights going out, people screaming, rushing about. A perfect opportunity for someone to do something, and perhaps not be seen clearly. Or to be seen exactly where they shouldn't be, creating an alibi for something else." Dolly's eyes widened. "Good heavens, Jane! You mean it could be a real murder, and the announcement is part of the plan?" "It is a possibility worth considering," Miss Marple murmured. "The specificity is troubling. Little Paddocks, 6:30 p.m., friends only. It suggests an intimacy, a knowledge of the household. And the wording, 'Please accept this your only intimation,' it feels almost formal, like an invitation one cannot refuse." Dolly shivered, the thrill momentarily replaced by a genuine chill. "But who? And why Miss Blacklock? She seems so respectable, ordinary." "Ordinariness can hide many things, Dolly, and respectability is often the best mask. We know very little of Miss Blacklock's life before she came here, don't we? Only that she worked as a companion abroad. Switzerland, wasn't it? And we know even less of her lodgers, or the reasons they are there, or Mitzi's past beyond the obvious tragedy." They sat in silence for a moment, the peaceful scene before them, children playing on the green, the distant chime of the church clock, now seeming to hold an undercurrent of menace. The notice, absurd on the surface, had cast a long shadow. "What will you do, Jane?" Dolly asked finally. "Just sit here and knit?" Miss Marple finished her row of knitting and carefully set it aside in her basket. She looked directly at Dolly, her blue eyes clear and surprisingly sharp. "No, Dolly," she said, her voice firm but quiet. "I believe I shall accept the invitation." Dolly gasped. "Go! To Little Paddocks? On Friday? At 6:30 p.m.? But it could be dangerous. What if someone does get killed?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said, a faint, determined smile touching her lips. "If it is a prank, then we shall have witnessed a piece of village absurdity. But if it is not, if there is real intent, then someone needs to be there who sees things, who notices the details others miss, who understands the little ways of people." She patted Dolly's hand. and I suspect, my dear, that you will wish to accompany me." Dolly drew herself up, a mixture of terror and exhilaration on her face. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, though Arthur will think I've gone completely mad. We'll need an excuse. Just calling socially. But it's 6:30 p.m. It's not exactly tea time." "We are friends of the village, concerned for Miss Blacklock's welfare after this dreadful notice," Miss Marple said smoothly. "We felt it our duty to offer support, and perhaps bring a small cake. One must always arrive empty-handed, even to a potential murder." Dolly giggled, a little hysterically. "A cake for a murder? Only you, Jane, would think of the cake. Right then, a cake it is, and our best hats. One must be properly dressed for an announcement of murder, don't you think?" Miss Marple stood, smoothing her cardigan. "Indeed, Dolly, one must always be prepared. Now, I think we should go home. There is much to consider before Friday, and much to observe between now and then." She looked towards Little Paddocks, barely visible through the trees. "The game, it seems, is afoot, and the first move has been made. Boldly, publicly, foolishly, or brilliantly. Time alone will tell." As they walked back towards the heart of the village, the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows. The peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead felt thin, like gauze stretched over something darker and more complex. The notice in the post office was no longer just a curiosity. It was a challenge, a key turning in a lock, opening a door into a mystery that had already begun to unfold in the quiet corners and whispered conversations of the village. Miss Marple felt the familiar, unwelcome yet compelling stir of her old friend, curiosity, sharpening into focus. Friday at 6:30 p.m., Little Paddocks. She would be there, and she would be watching.
Chapter 2. Gathering Storm. The Wednesday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn morning where the air felt scrubbed clean, carrying the faint, sharp scent of wood smoke and damp earth. But in St. Mary Mead, the pristine air felt charged, humming with an undercurrent of nervous energy that prickled the skin like static. The notice in the post office was no longer just a curiosity. It was a spectre haunting every conversation, every glance cast towards Little Paddocks, perched on its slight rise at the village edge. Miss Jane Marple, however, moved through her morning routine with her customary, unhurried grace. There was a stillness about her, a deceptive calm that masked a mind working with the quiet, relentless precision of a master watchmaker. After a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she donned her tweed coat and sensible shoes, her basket over her arm, and set out. Her destination was not the tea shop or the vicarage, but the village hardware store, a place of sawdust, oil, and practical necessities, presided over by Mr. Ames, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease and whose knowledge of his stock was encyclopedic. The bell above the door jangled as she entered. Mr. Ames, deep in conversation with a farmer about the merits of different fencing wire, looked up. "Morning, Miss Marple. What can I do for you today? Need a new trowel handle? That old one looked a bit wobbly." "Good morning, Mr. Ames," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the cavernous space. "No, the trowel is quite serviceable still, thank you. Actually, I was wondering if you had any of those small brass padlocks, the kind one might use for a garden shed or perhaps a diary." Mr. Ames nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Certainly do. Various sizes. Over here, aisle 3. He led the way, the farmer trailing behind, still debating wire. "Funny thing, though," Mr. Ames continued, his voice dropping slightly. "Young Patrick Simmons was in just yesterday asking for the very same thing, brass padlocks. Said he needed to secure some personal effects. Seemed a bit agitated, if you ask me." Miss Marple selected a small, sturdy lock, turning it over in her palm. "Oh, did he mention why he needed it now, specifically?" "Not really, just said it was urgent. Paid cash, quick as you like. Then he bought a length of sturdy rope as well, said he was helping Miss Blacklock tie back some overgrown shrubs." Mr. Ames scratched his chin. Though rope and a lock seems an old combination for gardening, don't it? Miss Marple murmured non-committally, her mind filing away the information. Patrick Simmons, agitated, buying locks and rope in cash. It could be entirely innocent, or it could be preparation. For what? Indeed, Mr. Ames, one does find the most peculiar combinations sometimes necessary. Thank you, this will do nicely. She paid, her movements unhurried, and left the store, the bell jangling softly behind her. The rope and lock purchase nagged at her. It spoke of secrecy, of something needing to be secured or restrained. And Patrick's agitation, was it fear, excitement, guilt? She decided a closer look at Little Paddocks was in order, not an intrusion, merely observation. She took a path that skirted the edge of the property, utilizing a thick hedge of laurel for cover. From this vantage point, she could see the side of the house and part of the overgrown garden at the rear. It was there she saw Mitzi. The young refugee woman, usually bustling with nervous energy, was huddled on a stone bench near the dilapidated greenhouse, her thin frame shaking with silent sobs. She clutched a small, worn photograph to her chest, her shoulders heaving. Miss Marple hesitated, then, moved by compassion and the need for information, she stepped softly onto the path. "Mitzi, my dear child, whatever is the matter?" Her voice was gentle, non-threatening. Mitzi jumped, a small cry escaping her lips. She scrambled to wipe her face, stuffing the photograph into her apron pocket. "Miss Marple, you frightened me. I did not hear you come." "I apologize, my dear. You seemed so distressed. Can I help? Is there anything wrong?" Miss Marple moved closer, her expression one of grandmotherly concern. Mitzi's eyes darted nervously toward the house, then back to Miss Marple. "Wrong. Everything is wrong. That terrible notice. They say someone will be killed. Here, on Friday. And Miss Blacklock, she is so angry, so scared. She shouts at everyone. At Patrick for buying silly locks. At Julia for asking questions. At me for crying. She says I am a fool, that it is nothing, just a stupid joke. But I know it is not. They will come for me. I know it, because of before." "Before, my dear," Miss Marple prompted softly, seating herself beside the girl on the cold stone. "Before when?" Mitzi shook her head violently, her dark hair flying. "I cannot say. It is too dangerous. But there are people, bad people, who think I know things about Miss Blacklock, things about Switzerland. They think she told me secrets. And now this notice, it is a warning. To her, to me. We are trapped." She buried her face in her hands, her body racked with sobs. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on the girl's bony shoulder. Switzerland again. Secrets, fear. It was a recurring theme, shrouded in Mitzi's understandable paranoia. Now, Mitzi, try to calm yourself. Inspector Craddock is coming. He will get to the bottom of this. And Miss Marple is here. We will not let anything bad happen to you or to Miss Blacklock." She spoke with quiet authority, the words a lifeline. "Tell me, has Miss Blacklock seemed different lately, before this notice? Worried about anything specific?" Mitzi sniffled, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Yes, for weeks. She looks at the letters, the bank letters, and she goes white, like a ghost. She talks on the telephone late at night, whispering. And she hides things, papers, in the old desk in the attic. I saw her. She thought I was cleaning downstairs, but I went up for clean sheets, and she was there, locking the desk drawer with a little key. She looked frightened, very frightened." The attic desk, bank letters, whispered phone calls, fear. The pieces were swirling, refusing to coalesce. Miss Marple patted Mitzi's hand. "Now there, you've been very brave telling me this. Try not to worry too much. Keep your eyes and ears open. But be careful, my dear, very careful. And if you see or hear anything unusual, anything at all, you come and find me, straight away."
Mitzi nodded, her eyes wide and trusting. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You are kind. Not like the others. They just stare and whisper." She managed a weak smile before scurrying back towards the house, casting fearful glances over her shoulder.
Miss Marple remained on the bench for a few moments longer, the sun warming her back, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling her nostrils. The picture was becoming clearer, yet more complex. Miss Blacklock was under financial pressure, hiding things, terrified. Mitzi was caught in the crossfire, burdened by secrets from the past. Patrick Simmons was buying locks and rope, agitated. And the murder announcement hung over them all, a deliberate, calculated act of malice. Who stood to gain? Who stood to lose? And why announce it? Her reverie was broken by raised voices drifting from the front of the house. She moved silently along the hedge until she could see the driveway. Miss Blacklock stood on the steps, her face flushed with anger, her usually composed posture rigid. Facing her, his own face contorted with frustration, was Patrick Simmons. "I told you, Patrick, it's impossible." Miss Blacklock's voice was sharp, cutting through the still air. "The money is simply not available, not until the quarter ends, and even then it's tied up. You knew the situation when you came here." "But it's an opportunity, Aunt Letitia," Patrick pleaded, his hands gesturing wildly. "A chance to get in on the ground floor. Henderson says it's a sure thing. We could triple the investment inside a year. Triple it. All I need is the capital, just a bridge loan until I can access my trust." "Henderson," Miss Blacklock scoffed. "Who is this Henderson? Another of your fly-by-night friends? I've heard enough about your sure things, Patrick. They usually end up costing me money I can ill afford to lose." She took a step down, her voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "And don't think I don't know why you're so desperate. Gambling debts again, is it? Or perhaps something worse?" Patrick flinched as if struck. "That's not fair. This is legitimate. Henderson is solid. And this isn't just about me. It's about securing our future, yours too. If this notice, if this thing on Friday causes trouble, scares people off, we need to be financially secure, independent." Miss Blacklock's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat, Patrick? Are you suggesting this farce has something to do with you pressuring me for money?" "No, of course not." Patrick looked genuinely horrified. "That's insane. Why would I—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair, his expression shifting from desperation to sudden calculation. But the timing. If people think it's connected to financial trouble, if they think I might be involved—" He paled slightly. "Oh, God, this is a mess, a complete mess." Miss Blacklock studied him, her anger momentarily replaced by a shrewd, assessing gaze. "Yes, Patrick, it is a mess. And your sudden need for large sums of money, coupled with this absurd announcement, does not paint you in a favorable light. Perhaps you should consider returning to town until this nonsense blows over." "And leave you here alone, with that hanging over us?" Patrick gestured vaguely towards the village. "No, I'll stay. But I need you to trust me, Aunt Letitia, just this once. Let me handle Henderson. Let me try to sort something out." Miss Blacklock sighed, the fight seeming to drain out of her, replaced by a profound weariness. "There is nothing to sort out, Patrick. The answer is no. Now please, I have a headache. We'll discuss this later." She turned and went back into the house, closing the door firmly behind her. Patrick stood on the drive for a long moment, staring at the closed door, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, frustration, fear, and a dawning, sickening realization of how his circumstances looked. He kicked viciously at a loose stone, then stalked off towards the village, his shoulders hunched. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. Financial pressure on Miss Blacklock, confirmed, Patrick's desperate need for money, his gambling hinted at, his awareness of how the murder notice reflected badly on him, his plea to handle Henderson. Was that a genuine investment opportunity or something more sinister? And Miss Blacklock's accusation, had she implied Patrick might be behind the notice to pressure her? It was a volatile mix: money, desperation, and a looming threat. She needed more. Specifically, she needed to understand the Swiss connection, the secrets Mitzi alluded to. the vicar's mention of Miss Blacklock's time there as a companion, Mrs. Hartnell's vague recollection of a Mrs. Godler. It was a thread that needed pulling. She recalled an old friend of hers, Hilda Baker, who had worked as a governess in Switzerland during the war. Hilda had a sharp memory and a wide circle of contacts. A visit was in order. Hilda lived in a charming, slightly chaotic cottage, filled with books, dried flowers, and the scent of lavender. She welcomed Miss Marple with delight, bustling to make tea. "Jane, how lovely to see you! What brings you to my little corner of the world? Not another mystery, I hope. St. Mary Mead seems to be brewing one, if the telephone wires are going by anything. Something about a murder announcement? Dreadful!" Miss Marple accepted the cup of tea Hilda offered. "Indeed, Hilda, most unsettling. It concerns a woman living in our village now, Miss Letitia Blacklock. I understand you may have encountered her during your time in Switzerland, or perhaps knew of the family she worked for?" Hilda's brow furrowed in concentration. Blacklock. Blacklock. Wait, not the companion to Belle Godler, the wealthy widow? Lived in that grand chalet near Montreux? Possibly, Miss Marple encouraged. What do you recall of them? Oh, Belle Godler. A sad case, really, Hilda sighed. Very rich, but quite frail after her husband died. No children. She had a sister, Charlotte, but Charlotte was, well, not quite right, I heard. Delicate, you know. Spent years in a sanatorium. Terribly tragic. Belle employed a companion, a Miss Blacklock. Letitia. Yes, that was the name. Efficient, quiet woman, kept Belle's household running smoothly. This was during the war, you see. Chaotic times. Lots of people moving about, identities blurred. Charlotte, Miss Marple prompted gently. The sister. What became of her? Hilda shook her head. Died, I believe. Quite suddenly, not long after Belle passed. Heart failure, I heard. Such a shame. Belle left her entire fortune to Charlotte, of course, but since Charlotte predeceased her, well, the will was a bit of a mess. I heard there was some dispute. A distant cousin tried to claim, I think, but Belle had made a later will, leaving everything to someone else. A charity, perhaps, or maybe the companion. One loses track. She sipped her tea. Why the interest, Jane? Is Miss Blacklock in some kind of trouble? She's at the center of this announcement, Hilda, Miss Marple said carefully, and there are whispers about her past, about money, about Switzerland. She paused. You mentioned identities being blurred during the war, and that Charlotte died before Belle? Yes, that's right. Belle died first. No, wait, actually, I'm getting muddled. Let me think. Belle was very ill for a long time. Charlotte died. Yes, it was before Belle, but Belle was so frail herself perhaps she didn't even hear, or perhaps... Oh dear, memory is such a tricky thing. I do recall there was talk after Belle died that the companion, Miss Blacklock, seemed rather, well off. Suddenly. Bought a small place of her own. But that could just be efficient saving, couldn't it? Companions often get bequests. Miss Marple absorbed this. Belle Godler, wealthy widow, Sister Charlotte, supposedly delicate, died before Belle. Belle's will, originally leaving everything to Charlotte, but since Charlotte predeceased her, well, the estate went elsewhere, possibly to Miss Blacklock, and suddenly Miss Blacklock was well off. The Swiss connection was deepening, swirling around inheritance, identity, and the fog of war. If Charlotte died before Belle, then Miss Blacklock inheriting made sense. But Mitzi's terror, Miss Blacklock's fear, the hidden papers, it suggested something was profoundly wrong with that neat picture. She thanked Hilda. You've been most helpful. She rose. It seems the past can cast a very long shadow. Indeed it can, Hilda Jane. Do be careful. If there's money involved and whispers of murder, it's not a game for old ladies. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One does what one can, Hilda. One does what one can. As she walked back toward St. Mary Mead, the afternoon light was softening, lengthening the shadows. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, Financial pressure, Patrick's desperation and suspicious purchases, Mitzi's terror and hints of Swiss secrets, Hilda's revelations about the Godler sisters and Miss Blacklock's sudden wealth, and the chilling, specific murder announcement. They refused to fit neatly. The central figure, Miss Blacklock, was a vortex of fear and hidden truths. Who was she really? What was she hiding? And who wanted her dead badly enough to announce it in advance? The answer, she felt, lay hidden within Little Paddocks itself. Mitzi had mentioned papers locked in the attic desk. It was a risk.
A considerable one, but the need for tangible evidence was becoming urgent. Inspector Craddock would arrive tomorrow. She needed to give him something concrete to work with, beyond village gossip and her own unsettling intuitions. Returning home, she waited until dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of violet and orange. She changed into dark, practical clothes, retrieved a small, powerful torch from a drawer, and slipped out of her cottage, merging with the deepening shadows. She moved not towards the front of Little Paddocks, but around the back, towards the old, disused servants' entrance she'd noted during her earlier observations. The lock was rusty, but yielded to a firm, careful twist of her hairpin, a skill learned long ago from a mischievous nephew. The interior of Little Paddocks was silent, thick with the dust of disuse and the faint smell of furniture polish. Miss Marple moved like a ghost, her torch beam a narrow pencil of light, avoiding the creaky floorboards she'd mapped in her mind during previous, legitimate visits. She ascended the narrow, creaking back stairs to the attic. The air up here was stale, colder, smelling of old trunks and forgotten memories. The desk Mitzi mentioned stood against the far wall, a simple, old-fashioned writing desk. Miss Marple shone her torch on it. One drawer was indeed fitted with a small, ornate keyhole. She tried the drawer. Locked. Her eyes scanned the desk's surface. Nothing. She ran her fingers along the underside of the writing slope. Nothing. She checked the dusty blotter. Beneath it, tucked into a groove almost invisible, lay a small brass key. Her heart beat a little faster as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. She pulled the drawer open. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed stationery and a dried-up inkwell, was a slim, leather-bound ledger. Miss Marple carefully lifted it out. Opening it, her torch beam illuminated neat, precise columns of figures and dates. Entries spanned several years. She scanned the pages, her eyes narrowing. Large sums of money moving out of accounts labeled L. Blacklock, personal. Entries marked Swiss transfer, confidential. Payments to Henderson & Co., the name Patrick had mentioned. And then more recently, entries marked urgent repayment, due. The amounts were significant, far exceeding what a companion's salary or even a modest inheritance might cover. The final entry, dated just last week, was a single, stark word in red ink, critical. This was the financial pressure the vicar had hinted at, the source of Miss Blacklock's fear. She was deeply indebted, possibly to this Henderson, and the repayments were overdue. Critical. And Patrick knew Henderson. Was he involved? Was he pressuring her? Or was he merely another pawn, desperate for funds himself? As she carefully replaced the ledger, her torch beam caught the edge of another item tucked at the very back of the drawer. She pulled it out. It was not paper. It was a small framed photograph, turned face down. Miss Marple hesitated, then turned it over. The photograph showed two women standing on a mountain path, the Swiss Alps majestic behind them. One was unmistakably Miss Blacklock, though younger, her face softer, less lined. The other woman— Miss Marple caught her breath. She bore a striking resemblance to Miss Blacklock, similar build, similar coloring, but her features were subtly different. The eyes were wider, the mouth less firm. And her expression, it was haunted, fearful. Scrawled on the back in faded ink were two names, Belle and Charlotte, and underneath, in a different, sharper hand, the switch? Miss Marple stared at the photograph, the implications crashing over her like a wave. Belle and Charlotte, the sisters, the resemblance, the cryptic question. The switch? Was it possible? Was the woman everyone knew as Miss Blacklock not Letitia at all? Was she Charlotte, impersonating her sister? And if so, where was the real Letitia? What had happened to Belle? The inheritance, the sudden wealth, the hidden papers, the fear, Mitzi's terror about Swiss secrets? It all coalesced around this terrifying possibility. The murder announcement wasn't just a threat. It was a reckoning. Someone knew the truth, and they were coming to expose it or to silence it forever. She carefully replaced the photograph, locked the drawer, and slipped the key back into its hiding place. As she descended the attic stairs, the weight of the knowledge pressed down on her. Little Paddocks wasn't just a house holding secrets. It was a house built on a lie that was about to explode. Friday at 6:30 wasn't an announcement of a future murder. It was the deadline for a past one to be revealed. She slipped out the servant's door, locking it carefully behind her, and melted back into the shadows. The storm was gathering, and its heart was beating within those walls. And she, Jane Marple, now held the key to understanding why. The game was no longer afoot. It was a race against time.
Chapter 3. The Fatal Hour. Friday dawned under a sky the color of bruised plums, heavy and sullen, mirroring the oppressive weight that had settled over St. Mary Mead. The air, thick with unspoken dread, felt charged, as if the village itself was holding its breath. The notice in the post office, once a shocking curiosity, had become a malevolent prophecy, casting a pall over every activity. The usual cheerful clatter of the tea shop was muted, replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances. Even the church bell tolled with a leaden resonance. Miss Jane Marple, however, moved through her morning with an outward serenity that belied the sharp focus of her mind. She had spent a sleepless night turning over the implications of the photograph and the ledger. The switch, Belle and Charlotte, the critical financial state, Henderson, Patrick's desperation, Mitzi's terror. The pieces formed a terrifying mosaic, but the central image remained frustratingly obscured. Who was the woman in Little Paddocks, and who wanted her dead so badly they'd announce it? After a light breakfast, she received a brief, formal note from Inspector Craddock, confirming his arrival at noon and requesting her presence at Little Paddocks by 4 p.m. for a preliminary briefing before the event. The word event was chosen with deliberate, understated caution. Miss Marple penned a swift reply, agreeing, and then turned her attention to the promised cake. She baked a simple but elegant lemon drizzle, its bright scent a small defiance against the encroaching gloom. Dolly Bantry arrived shortly before 3, fluttering with nervous excitement. "Jane, are you truly sure about this? Arthur thinks I'm completely unhinged. Going to a murder announcement, Dolly? Have you taken leave of your senses? But I told him where Miss Marple goes, sense usually follows. Eventually." She peered at the cake. Lemon drizzle. Perfect. One mustn't face potential carnage on an empty stomach after all. "Quite right, Dolly," Miss Marple said, carefully placing the cake in its carrier. "One must maintain standards, and observation requires sustenance." She glanced at the sky. "It looks like rain. An atmospheric touch, don't you think?" By 4:15 p.m., they arrived at Little Paddocks. The house, usually cheerful, seemed shuttered and unwelcoming. Inspector Craddock's police car was already parked outside, a stark symbol of official intrusion. Inside, the atmosphere was brittle. Miss Blacklock, pale but composed, greeted them with a strained smile. Inspector Craddock, a man in his late 40s with intelligent, weary eyes, stood near the fireplace, radiating quiet authority. Also present were Dr. Haydock, the village GP, looking grim, Patrick Simmons, pacing restlessly, his sister Julia, pale and quiet, Edmund Swettenham, lounging in an armchair with an unnerving stillness, Philippa Hames, looking composed but watchful, and Mitzi, who burst into theatrical tears at the sight of Miss Marple. "Ah, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, thank you for coming," Craddock said, his voice calm and measured. "As you know, we're treating this with utmost seriousness. While it may be an elaborate hoax, the potential for harm, either accidental or deliberate, is significant. My men are positioned discreetly outside. Inside, I must ask everyone to remain calm and follow instructions. The lights will be on until precisely 6:30 p.m. At that moment, they will be extinguished. A controlled blackout, I assure you, not a failure. They will come back on within seconds. If anyone sees or hears anything unusual during that brief darkness, I want them to remain exactly where they are and call out. Do not move. Do not touch anything. Is that understood?" A chorus of nervous assents filled the room. Miss Blacklock wrung her hands. "Inspector, are you quite sure this is necessary? It feels like inviting trouble." "On the contrary, Miss Blacklock," Craddock replied firmly, "it's about controlling the environment. If someone intends mischief, we want to witness it under conditions we manage. Now, positions. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, if you'd take the sofa near the window. Dr. Haydock, perhaps the armchair opposite. Mr. Simmons, please stop pacing. Sit here." He directed everyone like a chess master arranging pieces. "Miss Blacklock, I suggest you remain here, by the fireplace. It's central, observable." The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Conversation was stilted, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. Mitzi sniffled intermittently. Patrick cracked his knuckles. Julia stared at her hands. Edmund Swettenham appeared to be dozing. Philippa Hames meticulously examined a loose thread on her sleeve. Miss Marple, seemingly absorbed in her knitting, was actually cataloging every detail. The slight tremor in Miss Blacklock's hand as she adjusted a clock on the mantelpiece, the way Patrick's eyes kept darting towards the hallway leading to the back of the house, the unnatural stillness of Edmund Swettenham, the faint scent of cordite that seemed to cling to the air near the French windows, though that might be imagination. At 6:25 p.m., Craddock checked his watch. 5 minutes, everyone. Please remain seated. Stay calm. He moved towards the light switch by the door. The room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the frantic beating of hearts.
6:29. 6:30. Click. Darkness. Absolute suffocating darkness. For perhaps 2 seconds there was only the sound of breathing. Then, crack! Crack! 2 sharp reports, unmistakably gunshots, echoing with shocking loudness in the confined space. A woman's scream, Mitzi's. A gasp from Julia. A shout from Craddock. "Nobody move! Lights!" Click. Light flooded the room, harsh and revealing after the sudden darkness. Chaos erupted. Mitzi was screaming hysterically, pointing towards the doorway. "Blood! Blood! He is shot! Dead!" Dr. Haydock was already on his feet, moving swiftly. Inspector Craddock had drawn his service revolver, his eyes scanning the room with laser focus. Miss Marple's gaze snapped to the doorway. A man lay crumpled on the threshold, half in, half out of the room. He was dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, a cheap cloth cap pulled low. His face was contorted in a rictus of surprise and pain, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his chest. Dead. Undeniably dead. But it wasn't the only shock. Miss Blacklock was standing by the fireplace, one hand clutched to the side of her head. Blood welled between her fingers, trickling down her neck. She swayed, her face pale as chalk.
"Miss Blacklock," Craddock shouted, moving towards her, but Dr. Haydock was already there. "Let me see, Letitia. Haydock said gently, guiding her to a chair. "It's your ear. A graze, I think. Superficial, but bleeding freely. Hold this." He pressed a handkerchief to her head. The room was pandemonium. Mitzi was wailing. Julia was crying quietly. Patrick looked stunned, his face ashen. Edmund Swettenham had finally moved, leaning forward with intense interest. Philippa Hames stood frozen, her eyes wide. Dolly Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. Craddock regained control. "Silence! Everyone stay where you are! Dr. Haydock, attend to Miss Blacklock. Constable Jenkins," he called towards the hall, "secure the perimeter. No one leaves. Check all exits." He turned to the body. "Anyone know this man?" He scanned the faces, blank shakes of the head. "He came through that door," Craddock stated, pointing to the main entrance into the hall. "Shot twice, once fatally, once, seemingly a miss, that struck Miss Blacklock." He looked at her. "Can you tell us anything, Miss Blacklock? Did you see him, hear anything before the lights went out?" Miss Blacklock, holding the handkerchief to her head, looked dazed. "No, nothing. Just darkness. Then the shots. And pain, like a bee sting. Here." She touched her ear. "I didn't see anyone. Just heard the shots." Craddock's men moved efficiently, cordoning off the doorway and the body. Craddock himself began a meticulous examination of the scene, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the position of the body, sprawled awkwardly, one arm outstretched toward the room. He examined the doorframe, the floor around the body. He looked at the fireplace where Miss Blacklock had been standing. Miss Marple, however, was observing different details. She noticed that the large, heavy velvet curtain covering the French windows was slightly disarranged, as if recently brushed against. She saw that the small ornate clock on the mantelpiece, the one Miss Blacklock had adjusted just before 6:30, was now stopped. Its hands showed 6:32. And most significantly, she saw a faint, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the polished floorboards near the leg of the heavy mahogany desk that stood against the far wall, partially obscured by an armchair. It looked fresh. Craddock finished his initial survey. "Right. Dr. Haydock, how is Miss Blacklock?" "Shock, mainly. The ear wound is shallow. Bleeding looks worse than it is. She needs rest and quiet," Haydock reported. "Miss Blacklock," Craddock said gently but firmly, "I need to ask you to remain here for now. I'll have someone take a detailed statement shortly. Everyone else, please remain in the room. I need to speak to each of you individually. Constable, start with Mr. Simmons." As Craddock began his methodical interviews, the atmosphere remained thick with shock and fear. Miss Marple watched and listened, her mind working furiously. The dead man was a stranger, an intruder. But why announce a murder at Little Paddocks only to have an unknown criminal shot dead? Was he the intended murderer, or was he the intended victim? And why shoot Miss Blacklock, or was she merely collateral damage? The graze seemed convenient, almost theatrical. Dolly whispered, "Jane, who is he? A burglar? And poor Miss Blacklock. It's a miracle she wasn't killed." "Indeed, Dolly," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes fixed on the stopped clock. "A miracle, or perhaps something else entirely." Craddock interviewed Patrick first. Patrick claimed he'd been sitting in his assigned chair, facing the fireplace. He had seen nothing, heard only the shots. He seemed genuinely shaken, insisting he knew nothing about the dead man. Julia corroborated his position, adding that she'd been too frightened to move. Edmund Swettenham, interviewed next, was unnervingly calm. He had been sitting near the French windows, he said, observing the play of light and shadow before the blackout. He'd heard the shots, seen the flash, but nothing else. His alibi seemed flimsy, but his demeanor was unshakable. Philippa Hames stated she'd been sitting near Miss Marple, knitting. She had seen nothing unusual before the lights went out. Mitzi, when Craddock finally got to her, was hysterical, alternating between wails about the dead man and declarations that she knew nothing at all. She insisted she'd been standing near the serving hatch, terrified. Finally, Craddock approached Miss Marple and Dolly. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, your observations, please, anything at all, however trivial." Dolly recounted the sequence of events, the darkness, then the shots, the screams, the lights revealing the horror. Miss Marple spoke softly. "It was all very sudden, Inspector. The darkness, then the shots, 2 distinct reports, then the light. The man, he seemed to be falling into the room, Inspector, not falling backwards as if shot from within. His momentum was forward." Craddock nodded. "I noted that. Suggests he was shot from the hall as he entered, or possibly from just outside the door." He paused. "Anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated, then gestured subtly towards the mantelpiece. "The clock, Inspector, the small carriage clock. It appears to have stopped at 6:32. Craddock followed her gaze. "Probably jarred by the shots or when Miss Blacklock was hit. It's an old clock, sensitive." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, "though it seemed to be running perfectly just before the blackout. Miss Blacklock adjusted it herself. She didn't mention the scuff mark near the desk, not yet. It was too vague, too easily explained, but she filed it away. And the disarranged curtain, why?" Craddock thanked them and moved to speak briefly with Miss Blacklock again, who was now sipping tea brought by a solicitous Julia. Miss Marple took the opportunity to move closer to the French windows. She examined the curtain. A few threads were caught on the latch as if pulled hastily, and outside, on the damp terrace, she noticed something small and glinting, half hidden beneath a rhododendron bush. A button. Not a modern button, but an old-fashioned mother-of-pearl one, like those found on a waistcoat or smoking jacket. It looked out of place. She didn't touch it. Instead, she rejoined Dolly, who was watching Craddock with fascination. "What do you think he'll do next, Jane? Arrest someone?" "Unlikely yet, Dolly," Miss Marple murmured. "He needs to identify the victim first, understand why he was here, and who fired those shots." As if on cue, Craddock rejoined the group, his expression grave. "We've identified the man," he announced. "His name is Rudi Scherz, known to the police. A petty criminal, small-time confidence man, recently released from prison. He was wanted for questioning in connection with a series of burglaries in the next county. More importantly," Craddock paused, letting the information sink in, "we found this in his pocket." He held up a small folded piece of paper. "It's a note addressed to him. It says, 'Little Paddocks, Friday 6:30, side door unlocked, opportunity, be ready, payment afterwards, a friend.'" A collective gasp went through the room. Mitzi let out a shriek and fainted dramatically into Julia's arms. Patrick paled even further. Edmund Swettenham raised an eyebrow. Philippa Hames looked down at her hands.
He looked around the room, his gaze sharp and assessing. Who here knew Rudi Scherz? Who had contact with him? Who stood to gain by his death or by creating chaos here tonight? The questions hung in the air, thick and accusatory. Miss Marple watched the reactions. Patrick looked sick. Julia terrified. Mitzi, revived, was sobbing uncontrollably. Edmund Swettenham seemed thoughtful. Philippa Hames remained composed, almost detached. Miss Blacklock, clutching her bandaged head, looked bewildered and deeply frightened. But Miss Marple's mind wasn't focused on Scherz's known associates or the obvious suspects. Her thoughts circled back to the details: the stopped clock at 6:32, the scuff mark near the desk, the disarranged curtain, and the mother-of-pearl button outside. And Miss Blacklock adjusting that clock just moments before the blackout. Why? "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but cutting through the tension, "you said the shots came from the hall as Scherz entered." "That's the most likely scenario, yes," Craddock agreed. "The trajectory suggests it." "Yet," Miss Marple continued gently, "Miss Blacklock was standing by the fireplace, some distance from the doorway. If the shooter was aiming for Scherz in the doorway and Miss Blacklock was merely collateral damage, how did the bullet manage to graze her ear? It seems a remarkably precise, yet glancing blow for a shot fired in the dark at a moving target in a doorway." Craddock frowned. "A ricochet? Unpredictable in the dark?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded. "But consider this. The clock stopped at 6:32, 2 minutes after the announced time and the lights came on. Clocks can be stopped by a jolt, yes, but they can also be stopped deliberately, by someone who needed to alter the timeline, to create confusion about when events truly happened." She looked directly at Craddock. "And the second shot, Inspector, the one that missed Scherz and grazed Miss Blacklock, was it really a miss? Or was it staged?" A stunned silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to Miss Marple. "Staged?" Craddock repeated, incredulous. "Why would anyone stage shooting Miss Blacklock?" "To create a victim," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze unwavering. "To create sympathy, to deflect suspicion, to make it appear that Miss Blacklock herself was the target, when perhaps she was not the target at all. Perhaps Rudi Scherz was merely the opening act, the distraction, and the real target, the real intended victim of this elaborate charade, is still safely inside this room, unharmed, watching." She let her gaze sweep across the faces. Patrick's confusion, Julia's fear, Mitzi's renewed terror, Edmund's sudden stillness, Philippa Hames's unreadable expression, and finally Miss Blacklock's wide, startled eyes. Miss Marple didn't accuse, she merely laid out the chilling possibility. "The announcement wasn't about killing someone at Little Paddocks tonight, Inspector," Miss Marple concluded, her voice barely a whisper in the stunned room. "It was about creating the perfect cover for a murder that was always intended to happen. Rudi Scherz was the sacrifice, the chaos was the camouflage, and the real killer, the real intended victim of this elaborate charade, is still here, waiting, believing their plan has worked, believing they are safe." She looked at the stopped clock. "But time, Inspector, like the truth, has a way of catching up, and it appears someone tried to stop it tonight." The chapter closed on the image of Miss Marple standing quietly amidst the shock and fear, her simple declaration hanging in the air like a challenge. The body of Rudi Scherz lay in the doorway, a pawn sacrificed in a deadly game. Miss Blacklock clutched her bandaged head, no longer just a victim, but potentially the central figure in a far more complex and sinister plot. And Inspector Craddock, his professional certainty shaken, stared at the stopped clock, realizing that the fatal hour had not ended with the shots. It had only just begun. The real hunt was now on.
Chapter 4. Web of Secrets. The aftermath of the fatal hour at Little Paddocks clung to St. Mary Mead like a damp fog, thick and unsettling. The village, usually a picture of English tranquility, now buzzed with a feverish energy. Curtains twitched incessantly, conversations in the tea shop dropped to whispers at the approach of outsiders, and the name Rudi Scherz was spoken only in hushed, fearful tones.
The police presence, initially discreet, became more pronounced. Constables patrolled the lanes, and Inspector Craddock established a temporary command post in the village hall, transforming the space, usually reserved for jumble sales and WI meetings, into a hive of official activity. Miss Jane Marple, however, found the enforced confinement within Little Paddocks, now a crime scene under guard, stifling. While Inspector Craddock conducted his formal interviews, Miss Marple understood that the most revealing information often came not from direct questioning, but from the cracks in the everyday facade, the unguarded moments when people believed themselves unobserved. She needed to move, to listen, to watch the ripples spreading outward from the stone dropped into their quiet pond. Her opportunity came 2 days after the shooting. The vicar, ever the pillar of community spirit, and perhaps hoping to restore a semblance of normalcy, had organized a small garden party at the vicarage. It was billed as a charity tea for the church roof fund, but everyone knew its true purpose: to allow the villagers to come together, to process the shock, and perhaps to observe each other. Miss Marple, accompanied by a still thrilled Dolly Bantry, attended with quiet determination. The vicarage garden, usually a riot of late summer color, seemed subdued under the gray sky. Tables laden with scones and sandwiches stood largely untouched. Conversations were muted, clustering in tight knots that broke apart as Craddock or one of his officers moved through the crowd. Miss Blacklock was present, her ear still bandaged, looking pale but resolute, flanked by a protective Julia. Patrick hovered nearby, looking restless and ill at ease. Edmund Swettenham stood alone near the rose bushes, smoking a cigarette and observing the scene with detached amusement. Philippa Hymes was helping Mrs. Carpenter pour tea, her movements precise and calm. Mitzi had not been invited. Craddock deemed her too unstable for public questioning yet. Miss Marple circulated slowly, accepting a cup of tea from Philippa, exchanging pleasantries with the vicar's wife, pausing to admire a particularly fine chrysanthemum. She listened. She heard Mrs. Price Ridley holding forth to a rapt group about the dangers of foreign elements, a not-so-subtle dig at Mitzi and the dead Scherz. She overheard Mr. Pye speculating loudly about life insurance policies and hidden debts. She caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 farmers. Heard Blacklock was deep in it with some moneylender. Henderson name was. Nasty piece of work. Patrick Simmons mixed up with him too, they say. Henderson, again. The name echoed like a discordant bell. Miss Marple filed it away. She drifted towards where Patrick stood, pretending to examine a bed of asters. He was speaking in low, urgent tones to a young man Miss Marple didn't recognize. Sharp features, expensive suit, an air of restless energy. "Absolutely not the time, Henderson," Patrick hissed, glancing nervously around. "The police are crawling all over the place. They found Scherz with that note. They'll be tracing it." "Relax, Simmons," the other man, Henderson presumably, replied smoothly, though his eyes held a hard glint. The note was anonymous, untraceable. Scherz was a loose end, tidied up. Our business remains confidential. Unless you want to make difficulties? Patrick flushed. Of course not. But the money, the terms, after this, the pressure is on, my friend. Miss Blacklock needs liquidity, fast. You convince her, or the alternative arrangements we discussed become necessary. Understood? He didn't wait for an answer, clapping Patrick on the shoulder with a force that looked anything but friendly, before melting into the crowd. Patrick stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of fear and resentment. He looked hunted. Miss Marple moved away before he could notice her observation. Alternative arrangements?
What did that mean? Blackmail? Worse? And Henderson's casual dismissal of Scherz's murder as tidying up a loose end was chilling. It confirmed Scherz wasn't just a random burglar lured by opportunity. He was part of Henderson's web, and his death was planned. But by Henderson, or by someone else using Henderson's methods? Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the lily pond at the bottom of the garden. A woman's scream, sharp and terrified, cut through the subdued chatter. Miss Marple and Dolly, along with half the party, hurried towards the sound. Dr. Haydock was already there, kneeling beside the pond's edge. Floating face down in the murky water, her pale yellow dress billowing around her like a drowned water lily, was a woman. Dr. Haydock gently turned her over. Miss Marple recognized her with a jolt. It was Mrs. Eleanor Vane, a quiet, middle-aged woman who lived alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village. She ran a modest laundry service and occasionally did mending for some of the village households, including, Miss Marple recalled, Little Paddocks. "Good God!" Dr. Haydock muttered, checking for a pulse. He looked up, his face grim. "She's gone. Drowned. But look!" He pointed to the back of the woman's head. Matted in her gray hair was a dark, sticky substance. Blood. A significant blow. She didn't just fall in. She was pushed, or struck first. Inspector Craddock, alerted by the scream, arrived, his face tightening as he took in the scene. Mrs. Vane? What on earth was she doing here? He immediately began cordoning off the area, his voice sharp with authority. Who saw her last? When? Panic rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Vane was unassuming, practically invisible in village life. Why would anyone murder her? And here, at the vicarage garden party. Miss Marple watched the reactions. Miss Blacklock looked genuinely shocked and distressed. Patrick Simmons went visibly paler. Edmund Swettenham raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something, interest in his eyes. Philippa Himes simply looked sad. But it was the reaction of Julia Simmons that caught Miss Marple's attention. Julia, who had been standing close to her aunt, swayed slightly, her hand flying to her mouth.
Her eyes weren't fixed on the body, but on Miss Blacklock, her expression one of dawning, horrified comprehension. Later, after the body had been removed and the shocked partygoers dispersed, Miss Marple found Julia Simmons alone in the vicarage's small conservatory, staring blankly at a fern. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, stepping inside, "you look quite undone. Can I get you a glass of water?" Julia jumped, her eyes wide and frightened. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in." She tried to compose herself, but her hands were trembling. "It was a terrible shock for everyone," Miss Marple said gently. "Poor Mrs. Vane. Such a quiet soul. Did you know her well?" Julia shook her head, then hesitated. "Not well. She did some mending for us, for Aunt Letitia, occasionally." She lowered her voice. "But, Miss Marple, I think she knew something." "Knew something, my dear?" Miss Marple prompted, keeping her voice calm. "About Switzerland," Julia whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. About Aunt Letitia's past, before she came here. Mrs. Vane, she worked as a nurse years ago, in Switzerland, at a sanatorium near Montreux. She mentioned it once, when she was repairing a tear in Aunt Letitia's favorite shawl. She said the view from the sanatorium reminded her of home, of the hills. Aunt Letitia, she went very still, very quiet, changed the subject sharply. Miss Marple's heart gave a familiar, steady beat of recognition. A sanatorium near Montreux, where Belle Goodler possibly resided, where Charlotte was said to have been delicate. Julia nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes, that's the one. And after that notice appeared, Mrs. Vane came to the house, not for mending. She asked to speak to Aunt Letitia privately. I heard them arguing. Mrs. Vane sounded upset. She kept saying, "It wasn't right, Letitia. You know it wasn't right. People deserve to know the truth." Aunt Letitia was furious, told her to leave, to keep her foolish notions to herself. Mrs. Vane looked desperate, scared. She said, "The truth will out, Letitia. It always does. And now, she's dead." Julia shuddered. Do you think Aunt Letitia?" Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on Julia's arm. "It is certainly a dreadful coincidence, my dear, and Mrs. Vane's knowledge clearly posed a threat to someone, but we mustn't jump to conclusions. Inspector Craddock will investigate thoroughly." She paused. "Did Mrs. Vane mention anyone else? Anyone she might have spoken to about her suspicions?" Julia frowned, trying to remember. "No, not then, but later I saw her, yesterday, near the village green. She was talking to Mitzi. They looked intense. Mitzi was crying. Mrs. Vane put a hand on her arm. She looked kind, determined." Mitzi. Again, the terrified maid was at the center of the storm. Miss Marple thanked Julia and left her to compose herself, her mind racing. Mrs. Vane wasn't just a random victim. She was a link to the Swiss past, a potential witness who knew the truth about Miss Blacklock's identity. Her argument with Miss Blacklock, her desperate words, her conversation with Mitzi, it painted a clear picture. She was investigating, and someone had silenced her, permanently. Driven by this new urgency, Miss Marple decided she needed to speak to Mitzi. Craddock might have deemed her too unstable for formal questioning, but Miss Marple knew that sometimes fear and grief could loosen tongues where official procedure failed. She found an opportunity later that afternoon. Mitzi had been allowed out of Little Paddocks under police escort to collect some personal items from her small room above the stables. Miss Marple intercepted her as the constable waited discreetly by the gate. "Mitzi, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "A moment, please. I was so sorry to hear about Mrs. Vane. Such a tragedy." Mitzi flinched, her eyes darting around wildly. "Tragedy? Yes, tragedy. She was kind to me. She listened." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "She asked me questions about Switzerland, about Miss Blacklock, about the sister, Charlotte." "Did you tell her anything, Mitzi?" Miss Marple asked gently. No, I could not. It is too dangerous. But she knew things already. She said she nursed Charlotte at the sanatorium. She said Charlotte was not how they said, not delicate, not crazy. She was sad, very sad, and afraid of Belle. And then Belle died, and Charlotte disappeared. Mrs. Vane thought Miss Blacklock was not Letitia. She thought she was Charlotte, pretending. Mitzi's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. She said she had proof, a letter, something Belle wrote before she died. She was going to show it to someone, to the inspector. But now she is dead, and the letter, it is gone. A letter, the missing piece, proof of the switch. Mrs. Vane had it, and now she is dead, and the letter was missing. Stolen by her killer? Where is it now? "Did Mrs. Vane say where she kept this letter?" Miss Marple pressed. Mitzi shook her head. "No, but I think she might have hidden it. She was clever. She knew she was in danger. She told me, 'If anything happens to me, Mitzi, look in the place where the old stories are kept.' I did not understand then, but now Mitzi looked utterly lost. Where are old stories kept? Books? The library?" Miss Marple considered this. "The place where the old stories are kept," she murmured. "It could be literal, or it could be metaphorical. A place associated with memory, with the past. Mrs. Vane's cottage? But the police would be searching it. Somewhere public, somewhere unexpected." As if summoned by the thought, Inspector Craddock approached, his expression weary. "Miss Marple, Mitzi, I need to take Mitzi back now. We're searching Mrs. Vane's cottage thoroughly. If there's a letter, we'll find it." He looked at Mitzi. "You're sure she didn't give it to you or tell you exactly where it was?" Mitzi shrank back. "No, Inspector, I swear. She only said, 'Look in the place where the old stories are kept.' I do not know what that means." Craddock sighed. "Right. Come along, Mitzi." As he led her away, he gave Miss Marple a questioning look. "Old stories. Any ideas?" "Not yet, Mr. Inspector," Miss Marple admitted. "But it's a clue. Mrs. Vane was trying to tell us something, even in death." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clicking softly, watching the moon rise over St. Mary Mead. The pieces were falling into place with chilling clarity. The murder announcement hadn't been about killing Miss Blacklock. It was about creating chaos to cover the retrieval of something vital, the letter Mrs. Vane possessed. Scherz was the distraction, the sacrificial lamb sent in to create the diversion, the robbery note a convenient cover for his presence. The shooter in the hall, likely Henderson or someone working for him, intended to kill Scherz and Miss Blacklock, silencing both the loose end and the woman whose identity was the core of the secret. Miss Blacklock's survival was a fluke, the Greys a near miss. But Mrs. Vane, she was the real target. She had the proof. She was talking to Mitzi, preparing to go to Craddock. She had to be stopped before she revealed the truth about Charlotte impersonating Letitia. Her murder at the garden party was opportunistic, brutal, and efficient. The killer, knowing she'd be there, seized the chance to drown her and retrieve the letter. But where was the letter now? The place where the old stories are kept. Miss Marple turned the phrase over and over. Not a book, not a library. Something more personal, more hidden. Associated with Mrs. Vane's life, her work, her laundry service, mending, old stories, kept. Where?
Suddenly, it clicked. Not stories told, but stories woven. Threads. Fabric. Mending. Mrs. Vane was a laundress and seamstress. She worked with fabric, with threads, with the remnants of people's lives. Where would a seamstress keep something precious, something hidden? Not in a drawer, easily found. In her work basket? Tucked into a pincushion? Sewn into the lining of an old garment? But the police would search her cottage, her workroom. No, it had to be somewhere connected to her work, but outside her home. Somewhere she went regularly. Somewhere associated with the keeping of old things, old fabrics. The church. The vicarage held the jumble sales. The church itself had the storeroom, where old vestments, altar cloths, and donated fabrics were kept for cleaning, mending, or repurposing by the WI. It was a place steeped in history, in old stories, and Mrs. Vane, as a respected village woman doing mending for the church, would have had access. It was a long shot, but it felt right. Driven by a certainty that bordered on instinct, Miss Marple knew she had to act before Craddock's men, focused on the cottage, thought to look there. She couldn't go alone. She needed help. Someone who could move without raising suspicion. Dolly Bantry, ever game for adventure, was easily persuaded. The church vestry, at this hour? Jane, it's practically Gothic. But if you think that letter's there, lead on. My torch has fresh batteries. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped out of Miss Marple's cottage and made their way towards the church. The building loomed silent and ancient against the starlit sky. Using a key Miss Marple had borrowed years ago during a flower festival preparation and never returned, they let themselves into the side entrance. The air inside was cold, smelling of stone, wax polish, and dust. Miss Marple led Dolly not to the main altar, but down a narrow passage to the vestry, a small room lined with cupboards and shelves, stacked with folded linens, dusty boxes, and old garments. "Where would she hide it, Jane?" Dolly whispered, shining her torch around. "Not in plain sight," Miss Marple murmured, her own torch beam scanning the shelves. "Tucked away, sewn into something old, unlikely to be disturbed soon." Her beam fell on a large, flat box labeled Old Altar Cloths, Damaged, for repair or disposal.
Inside were several heavy, faded cloths, obviously stained or torn. Miss Marple carefully lifted one out. It was a deep crimson velvet, heavily embroidered but with a large, jagged tear near the hem. She ran her fingers along the rough edges of the tear. Something felt thicker than the fabric itself. Carefully, she worked her fingers into the split in the velvet lining. Her fingertips touched paper. With painstaking care, she eased a folded, yellowed envelope from its hiding place within the lining of the damaged altar cloth. Her heart hammered as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in faded, elegant handwriting. It was dated just weeks before Belle Goodler's death. The letter was short, devastating. My dearest Charlotte, the doctors tell me my time is short. I go to my grave with a heavy heart, knowing the burden I have placed upon you. Forgive me the deception, sister. It was the only way. The world believes you lost, delicate Charlotte, but you are stronger than they know. Take my name, my life, my fortune. Live freely as Letitia, away from the shadows that haunted our family. Destroy this letter once read. The past must stay buried. Let the world remember Belle, and let you live in peace as her companion, Letitia. No one must ever know the switch we made. Forgive me and live well. Your loving sister, Belle. Miss Marple read the words, the confirmation of her suspicions, sending a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold church. The switch was real. Charlotte, the delicate sister, had assumed the identity of her companion, Letitia Blacklock, after Belle Goodler's death. Miss Blacklock wasn't Miss Blacklock. She was Charlotte Goodler, living a lie built on her sister's deathbed wish and a stolen fortune. Mrs. Vane had known it. She'd had this letter, and she'd been killed for it. "We have it, Dolly," Miss Marple whispered, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the revelation. "The truth, the reason for everything." As she carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, a noise echoed from the nave of the church, the soft scrape of a shoe on stone. Someone else was there. They weren't alone. Miss Marple snapped off her torch, plunging the vestry into darkness. Dolly did the same, her breath catching in her throat. They stood frozen in the blackness, listening. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching the vestry door. The killer, realizing the letter might be hidden here? Or someone else entirely? The web of secrets had just become infinitely more dangerous, and they were caught in its center. The chapter closed on the sound of the vestry door handle slowly, silently beginning to turn.
Chapter 5. The Swiss Connection. The darkness in the vestry was absolute, a suffocating blanket woven from centuries of dust and whispered prayers. Miss Marple and Dolly Bantry stood frozen, their breaths shallow plumes in the chill air. The slow, deliberate scrape of a shoe on stone outside the door echoed with terrifying clarity, each scrape a hammer blow against their fragile concealment. The handle began to turn with an agonizing slowness, a metallic groan that seemed amplified in the silence. Miss Marple's mind, however, worked with cold, swift precision. Retreat? Confront? The vestry had no other exit. Hiding was futile. The intruder knew they were here. Why else approach so stealthily? Her hand, moving with the instinctive speed of long practice, found Dolly's wrist in the dark and squeezed, a signal for absolute stillness. She positioned herself slightly in front of Dolly, her slight form a frail shield, her eyes straining to pierce the gloom towards the opening door. The door swung inward. A thin beam of torchlight cut through the blackness, sweeping erratically across the stacked linens and dusty shelves before settling on the two women. It wasn't the broad, powerful beam of a police torch. It was smaller, weaker, trembling violently. The light traveled upwards, revealing a face etched with terror. Mitzi. Her eyes were wide, unblinking saucers of fear, her skin pallid, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, what are you doing here? You must go, quickly, it is not safe." "Mitzi," Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, her voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through her. "My dear child, you frightened us half to death. What are you doing here?" "I saw you," Mitzi gestured wildly towards the church entrance. "From my window. I saw you come in. I know why. The letter. Mrs. Vane's letter. You found it." Her gaze darted past them to the open box containing the damaged altar cloth, then snapped back, filled with fresh panic. "You must not have it. It is death. Mrs. Vane is dead because of it. They will kill you too." "Who, Mitzi?" Miss Marple pressed gently but firmly. "Who killed Mrs. Vane? Who is after the letter?" Mitzi shook her head violently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I do not know his name, only that he works for them, for the ones who want the truth buried forever, for Henderson, and for her." Her eyes flickered involuntarily towards the direction of Little Paddocks. "She is afraid, so afraid, and when she is afraid, she does terrible things, desperate things." "Miss Blacklock," Dolly breathed, clutching Miss Marple's arm. Mitzi flinched as if struck. "Do not say that name. That is not her name. She is Charlotte Goodler. And the money, Belle's money, it is cursed. It brings only death. Mrs. Vane knew. She was going to tell the inspector. And now you have the proof." Mitzi's gaze fixed on the envelope Miss Marple still clutched. "Burn it, please, before it is too late for all of us." "Burning evidence solves nothing, Mitzi," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unyielding. "The truth must come out. Mrs. Vane died for it. We owe it to her." She held up the envelope. "This letter proves the switch, but it doesn't explain everything. Why the fear now? Why the murder announcement? Why kill Scherz and Mrs. Vane?" Mitzi's terror seemed to momentarily war with a desperate need to unburden herself. Because someone found out, recently, someone from Switzerland, someone who knew Belle, who knew Charlotte. They contacted her, blackmailed her, demanded money to keep quiet. Henderson, he handles the money, but the blackmailer, he wanted more. He threatened exposure. That is why the announcement, to create chaos, to distract, to have an excuse if the blackmailer had to be silenced. She wrung her hands. "Scherz, he was supposed to be the blackmailer, I think, or just a tool. I don't know. It is all confusion. And Mrs. Vane, she found out about the blackmailer too. She talked to me. She said she knew who it was. And then she was dead." Mitzi dissolved into fresh sobs. "We must go, please, before he comes." "Who, Mitzi?" Miss Marple insisted. "Who is the blackmailer? Who contacted Miss Charlotte?" "I do not know his name," she wailed. "Only that he is Swiss, and dangerous, very dangerous. Please, Miss Marple, let us leave this place. It is haunted by death." Miss Marple knew Mitzi was too shattered to provide more coherent answers now. The priority was getting the letter to Craddock. "Very well, Mitzi, we're leaving. Now. You too. Come with us." She guided the trembling girl towards the door, Dolly close behind. As they emerged into the nave, the moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted ghostly patterns on the stone floor. The church felt charged, oppressive. Miss Marple scanned the shadows, half expecting to see a figure lurking, but the vast space seemed empty. Still, the feeling of being watched prickled her skin. They hurried out, locking the church door behind them. The cool night air was a relief, but the sense of imminent danger lingered. Miss Marple sent Dolly and a still weeping Mitzi back to the safety of Dolly's car with instructions to drive straight to the police station and wait for her. She, however, had one more crucial stop to make before dawn. The letter in her pocket was the key, but it needed context. She needed confirmation, details only an official source could provide. She needed to speak to Belle Goodler's former solicitor.
Mr. Throgmorton of Throgmorton and Pike resided in a stuffy, book-lined office in the nearby market town of Chipping Cleghorn. He was a man preserved in amber, his three-piece suit immaculate, his manner precise, his mind a repository of decades of discreet legal business. He received Miss Marple the next morning, his expression one of polite curiosity, tinged with slight annoyance at the early hour and the unorthodox nature of her visit, conveyed via a cryptic telephone message mentioning urgent matters concerning the late Mrs. Belle Goodler. "Miss Marple," he began, gesturing her to a worn leather chair opposite his vast mahogany desk, "a pleasure, though unexpected. Your message mentioned Mrs. Goodler, a sad case, if I recall correctly, died some years ago in Switzerland. Nasty business with her sister Charlotte predeceasing her. Complicated will." "Indeed, Mr. Throgmorton," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup of weak tea he offered. "It is precisely the complications surrounding Mrs. Goodler's estate and her sister that I wished to discuss. In the strictest confidence, of course." Throgmorton nodded, steepling his fingers. "Naturally. Client privilege is sacrosanct, even posthumously. How can I assist?" Miss Marple decided on a direct approach, gauging his reaction. "I have reason to believe, Mr. Throgmorton, that Charlotte Goodler did not in fact predecease her sister Belle. I believe Charlotte assumed the identity of Belle's companion, Miss Letitia Blacklock, and is currently living in St. Mary Mead under that name." Throgmorton's carefully composed expression didn't change, but Miss Marple noted a minute tightening around his eyes, a slight stillness in his posture, a flicker. Confirmation. "That is a most extraordinary allegation, Miss Marple," he said smoothly. "What evidence could possibly support such a claim?" "Several converging strands," Miss Marple replied, watching him intently. "Testimony from individuals who knew both sisters in Switzerland, the striking resemblance between them, and this." She carefully placed Belle's deathbed letter on his desk. Throgmorton picked up the letter, his hand perfectly steady. He read it slowly, his lips compressing into a thin line. When he finished, he placed it back down, his gaze now sharp and assessing. "Where did you obtain this?" "It was hidden by a woman who was recently murdered, Mr. Throgmorton," Miss Marple said quietly. "Eleanor Vane. She was a nurse at the sanatorium near Montreux, where Charlotte was supposedly a patient. She knew the truth. She was silenced." Sighed Throgmorton, a sound of profound weariness. "Poor Eleanor. I warned her. I told her the past was best left buried." He leaned back in his chair, the facade of the detached solicitor cracking slightly. "Yes, Miss Marple, your allegation is correct. Charlotte Goodler is alive. She is Letitia Blacklock. Belle orchestrated the switch before her death. I handled the legalities, the new will, the transfer of funds, the establishment of Miss Blacklock in England. It was unorthodox, but Belle was dying, Charlotte was vulnerable, and Belle believed it was the only way to protect her sister from certain elements in their past." "What elements, Mr. Throgmorton?" Miss Marple prompted. "What were they protecting her from?" Throgmorton hesitated, glancing towards the door as if fearing eavesdroppers. "The Goodler family wealth, it wasn't entirely clean, Miss Marple. Not illegally obtained, perhaps, but morally compromised. Belle's late husband had dealings before the war with, shall we say, unsavory characters. Extortionists, mainly. One particularly nasty piece of work named Rudolf Hesmer,
No relation to the infamous one, but equally unpleasant. He operated out of Montreux, preying on wealthy expatriates. He discovered something damaging about the Goodlers' pre-war finances, something that could have ruined Belle socially, financially. He blackmailed her for years. And Charlotte? Charlotte knew about Hesmar, Throgmorton continued, his voice lowering. She'd overheard conversations. Belle feared Hesmar would turn his attention to Charlotte if Belle died, believing the sister might be easier to intimidate or might not know how to handle him. The switch was Belle's desperate gambit. By becoming Miss Blacklock, Charlotte would be obscure, protected. Hesmar would lose his leverage, thinking the vulnerable sister was dead or gone. Belle left the bulk of her estate to Miss Blacklock in her final will, ensuring Charlotte had the means to disappear and live quietly. I facilitated it. Destroyed the original will naming Charlotte as heir, created the new one. It was a necessary deception. Necessary, perhaps, but built on a foundation of secrets. Secrets have a way of resurfacing, Mr. Throgmorton, especially when money is involved. Throgmorton nodded grimly. Indeed, and resurface it has. Recently I received a communication, anonymous, of course, demanding a substantial sum of money, threatening to expose Charlotte's true identity and the circumstances of Belle's deathbed switch if payment wasn't made. The implication was that exposure would not only ruin Charlotte, but also implicate me in irregularities regarding the will. Hesmar? Miss Marple suggested. Unlikely, Throgmorton scoffed. Hesmar disappeared during the war, presumed dead. No, this is someone else. Someone who found out, possibly through Mrs. Vane. She knew Charlotte and was in Switzerland. Or perhaps through someone connected to the sanatorium. The blackmailer used an intermediary, a man named Henderson. Henderson, Miss Marple exclaimed. He's been pressuring Charlotte, Miss Blacklock, for money. Patrick Simmons is involved with him, too. Throgmorton looked unsurprised. Henderson is a fixer, a middleman, handles dirty work for various clients. He's the one delivering the threats and collecting the payments, I have no doubt. He's also likely the one who arranged the murder announcement at Little Paddocks. Why? Miss Marple asked. Why such a public, dangerous stunt? Chaos and cover, Throgmorton stated flatly. The blackmailer was escalating, demanding more. Charlotte was near breaking point financially, thanks to Henderson's fees and her own imprudent investments. The announcement served multiple purposes. It created a smokescreen of confusion. It provided a plausible scenario for violence to erupt. If the blackmailer, or someone connected to him, happened to be killed during the event, it could be dismissed as part of the prank gone wrong. Scherz was likely a pawn Henderson used, perhaps lured with promises of robbery, then eliminated when he became a liability or served his purpose. And crucially, Throgmorton leaned forward, his eyes intense. It gave Henderson, or the blackmailer himself, a perfect opportunity to eliminate Charlotte under the cover of the chaos. Make it look like she was the intended victim of the announced murder all along, silencing her permanently before she could go to the authorities or run out of money. Her survival was a miscalculation.
And Mrs. Vane? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Vane was the wild card, Throgmorton sighed. She knew too much. She'd made contact with Charlotte, demanding she confess. Then she approached me, hinting she had proof, Belle's letter, I assume. When she threatened to go to the police, she signed her own death warrant. Henderson, or the blackmailer, silenced her at the first opportunity. The garden party was simply convenient. Miss Marple absorbed this. The picture was clearer, darker. Charlotte wasn't just a victim of identity theft, she was an active participant in a fraud born of fear, now trapped by blackmail and her own past decisions. Henderson was the spider in the web, but who was pulling his strings? Who was the anonymous blackmailer? "Who is the blackmailer, Mr. Throgmorton?" Miss Marple asked again. "You must have suspicions. Someone who knew the Godlers, knew Hesmer, knew about the switch." Throgmorton hesitated, then reached into a locked drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thin file. "I made some discreet inquiries after the first blackmail note arrived. Traced the postmark, made a few calls to old contacts in Switzerland. One name kept surfacing in connection with Hesmer's old network, a man who was known to be Hesmer's protege, a forger and extortionist himself. He vanished around the same time Hesmer did, rumored to have resurfaced in England after the war, under a new name." He opened the file, slid a photograph across the desk. It was a police mugshot, dated 1938. The man was sharp-featured, with cold, calculating eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. He looked familiar, but Miss Marple couldn't place him immediately. His name was Emil Langer. But if he's in England now, he's using another identity. He's clever, ruthless, and knows the Godler secrets intimately. He's the only one with the knowledge and the motive to blackmail Charlotte so effectively. Henderson works for him. Miss Marple studied the photograph. Langer. The name meant nothing, but the face. Where had she seen that coldness, that calculation? Not in St. Mary Mead, not recently, but the eyes. They reminded her of someone detached, observant, seemingly harmless. Edmund Swetnam. The resemblance wasn't exact, but the quality of the gaze, the intellectual coldness, the sense of watching from a distance was strikingly similar. Was it possible? Swetnam, the moody lodger writing poetry in his room? Could he be Emil Langer, the blackmailer? It seemed far-fetched, but it fit. His presence in Little Paddocks wasn't accidental. He was there to watch, to manipulate, to ensure Henderson did his job. "Thank you, Mr. Throgmorton," Miss Marple said, rising. "You have been most illuminating. This information and the letter must go to Inspector Craddock immediately." Throgmorton looked relieved. Indeed. The charade has gone on long enough. Charlotte, she's a frightened woman, Miss Marple, trapped by a lie she told out of love for her sister, and now by the vultures it attracted. She deserves a chance to face the consequences, whatever they may be. Miss Marple agreed, but a cold knot of dread remained. If Swetnam was Langer, he was far more dangerous than they'd imagined, and he was still under the same roof as Charlotte. Later that day, Inspector Craddock sat in his makeshift office at the village hall. The Bell Godler letter and Throgmorton's statement spread before him. His face was grim. Beside him sat a pale, trembling Charlotte Blacklock. No, Charlotte Godler, under formal caution. The facade of the capable village lady had crumbled, revealing a terrified woman haunted by her past. "It's true, Inspector," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything Mr. Throgmorton said. I am Charlotte Godler. Belle, she was dying. She was so afraid of Hesmer and what he might do to me after she was gone. The switch? It was her idea. I was unwell, fragile. I went along with it. Mr. Throgmorton arranged everything. We came to England. I became Letitia Blacklock. I tried to live quietly, to be worthy of Belle's sacrifice. But the money ran into trouble," Craddock stated flatly. Charlotte nodded miserably. "Investments, poor choices. Then the notes started, demanding money. threatening exposure. Henderson, he came. He said he represented the blackmailer. He demanded huge sums. I paid. I paid until I had almost nothing left. Then the announcement. I shuddered. He hinted it would solve the problem permanently. I didn't understand. I thought it was just a distraction. But then Scherz, the shooting. Mrs. Vane, she broke down, sobbing. I didn't want anyone hurt. I just wanted it to stop. Who is the blackmailer, Mrs. Godler? Craddock pressed. Who is Henderson working for? Charlotte wiped her eyes, her gaze distant with fear. I don't know his name. Henderson never said. Only that he was dangerous, connected to the old days in Switzerland. He said the man was watching, always watching. Her eyes flickered involuntarily toward the window, toward the direction of Little Paddocks. He's there now, isn't he? Watching this. Craddock followed her gaze. We have someone under surveillance at the house. We're watching everyone. But Miss Marple, standing quietly near the door, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Charlotte's fear wasn't just of exposure or prison, it was a primal terror of a specific person. Someone she believed capable of immense cruelty. Someone watching. Always watching. Edmund Swettenham's detached observation suddenly felt predatory. The photograph of Emil Langer superimposed itself in her mind over Swettenham's lounging form. The blackmailer wasn't just watching the investigation unfold from Little Paddocks. He was likely in this very room, hearing Charlotte's confession, gauging the threat, planning his next move. The web of secrets was tightening, and the deadliest spider was still hidden in plain sight. The chapter closed on Charlotte's broken whisper, "He'll never let me live now, never," and the chilling certainty that the most dangerous game was only just beginning.
Chapter 6. Unmasking the Imposter. The confession of Charlotte Godler, formerly known to St. Mary Mead as Miss Letitia Blacklock, sent shockwaves through Inspector Craddock's investigation, transforming it from a baffling murder case into a labyrinthine web of fraud, blackmail, and identity theft. The village hall, once a hub of jumble sales and WI meetings, now hummed with the tense energy of a major police operation. Constables bustled, telephones rang incessantly, and the air hung thick with the scent of stale tea and unresolved secrets. Miss Jane Marple, however, found the official headquarters stifling. While Craddock and his team meticulously cross-referenced Throgmorton's statement with Charlotte's confession and began the painstaking process of verifying the Belle Godler letter's authenticity, Miss Marple understood that the most critical evidence, the tangible proof of the how, lay hidden within Little Paddocks itself. Charlotte's fear of the ever-watching blackmailer, coupled with Edmund Swettenham's unsettling stillness, pointed towards a truth buried not in documents, but in the physical reality of the house and its inhabitants. Her opportunity came disguised as an act of village kindness. Mrs. Price Ridley, seizing the moral high ground, declared that the traumatized household at Little Paddocks needed proper sustenance and organized a roster of ladies to provide meals. Miss Marple, armed with a hearty beef stew and a basket of freshly baked bread, presented herself at the front door late the following afternoon. The house was under discreet police surveillance, but the atmosphere inside was one of brittle, exhausted quiet. Julia Simmons received her, looking pale and strained. "Miss Marple, how kind. Aunt Charlotte is resting. Dr. Haydock insisted. It's been too much." "Quite understandable, my dear," Miss Marple murmured, stepping into the familiar hallway. The air felt different now, charged with unspoken truths. "Where shall I put this?" "The kitchen, please. Mitzi is... well, Mitzi. She's trying, but she's barely functional." Julia led the way, her footsteps heavy. "Patrick's out.
said he needed to clear his head. Edmund's in his room, as usual. Her voice held a faint note of resentment. In the kitchen, Mitzi was listlessly wiping down a spotless countertop, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. She started violently when Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple, you should not be here. It is not safe." "Nonsense, Mitzi," Miss Marple said gently, placing the stew on the table. "The police are watching, and I brought food. We must all keep our strength up." She observed the girl's trembling hands, the way her eyes darted towards the cellar door. "You look exhausted, my dear. Perhaps you should sit down. I can manage this." Mitzi seemed to collapse in on herself, sinking onto a hard kitchen chair. "It is the watching," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Always watching. He sees everything, hears everything. Even the walls have ears now." "Who, Mitzi?" Miss Marple pressed, softly, keeping her tone conversational as she began unpacking the bread. "Mr. Whodunit?" Mitzi flinched as if the name itself was a blow. She glanced fearfully towards the ceiling, towards Edmund's room above. "He is quiet, too quiet, like a cat waiting to pounce. He moves without sound. He listens at doors. I found him yesterday, standing outside Charlotte's door, just standing, listening. When I asked what he wanted, he smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was cold, like ice." She shuddered. "He knows about Charlotte, about everything, and he is waiting. For what? I do not know, but it frightens me." Miss Marple's intuition sharpened. Whodunit's quiet observation was no longer poetic detachment. It was predatory surveillance. "Did you notice anything else unusual? Anything out of place? Anything he might have handled?" Mitzi frowned, concentrating through her fear. "Her room, it is always locked, always. But yesterday, I think he forgot, just for a moment. I went to take clean towels. The door was ajar. I peeked in. I know I should not have." She lowered her voice to a terrified whisper. "His desk, it was covered in papers. Not poetry, maps of Switzerland, and photographs, old photographs, of women. 2 women. They looked like Charlotte, but younger and different. One looked like kind, the other sad, very sad." She looked at Miss Marple, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "Belle and Charlotte. It was them. He has photographs of them. Why? Why would he have those?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Whodunit wasn't just a lodger. He was a collector of the past, a curator of the very deception that now threatened to unravel. "Thank you, Mitzi," Miss Marple said, her voice calm despite the chill spreading through her. "Try to rest now. I'll see myself out." Leaving Mitzi huddled by the stove, Miss Marple didn't head for the front door. Instead, she moved silently towards the back of the house, towards the narrow stairs leading to the upper floor. Edmund Whodunit's room was at the end of the landing, overlooking the back garden. The door is indeed closed now, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something glinting faintly near the lock. A tiny sliver of metal, barely visible, a broken piece of a lockpick, she suspected. He'd been in a hurry to lock it after Mitzi's interruption. Her gaze swept the landing. Opposite Whodunit's door was Charlotte's room. The door was slightly ajar. Miss Marple heard the low murmur of voices, Inspector Craddock speaking softly. He was likely taking Charlotte's formal statement. Perfect. She needed to see Whodunit's room, and Craddock's presence provided cover. She approached Whodunit's door, listening intently. Silence from within. Taking a deep breath, she tried the handle. Locked, of course. She knelt, examining the lock. It was an old-fashioned mortise lock. Her fingers, surprisingly nimble for all their knitting, explored the keyhole. The tiny sliver of metal Mitzi had mentioned was still lodged inside. Carefully, using a hairpin and the small, sturdy nail file from her handbag, tools she'd carried since her adventurous nephews taught her lockpicking decades ago, she worked the fragment free. Then, with a patience born of years of untangling skeins of wool, she manipulated the internal mechanisms. Click. The lock yielded. She slipped inside, closing the doors silently. The room was Spartan, almost monastic. A narrow bed, a wardrobe, a small desk beneath the window. The desk, as Mitzi described, was covered not in poetry manuscripts, but in detailed topographical maps of Switzerland, specifically the Montreux area. Pins marked locations: the Godler Chalet, the sanatorium, banks, hotels. Beside them lay the photographs Mitzi had seen. One showed Belle and Charlotte together on a mountain path, the same image Miss Marple had seen in the attic desk. Another showed Charlotte alone, looking haunted, taken outside what appeared to be the sanatorium. A third showed a younger, sharper-featured man standing beside a sleek black car. Emil Langer, unmistakably.
Though the photo wasn't labeled, he looked younger, colder, but the eyes held the same detached cruelty Miss Marple had seen in Swetnam's gaze. But it was the items under the maps that caught her breath. Tucked into a leather portfolio were sheets of high-quality watermarked paper, bottles of specialized ink, and a set of precision engraving tools, forger's tools. Beside them lay a small velvet-lined case. Inside, nestled in black silk, were several items: a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles with non-prescription lenses, a subtle false mole, a small container of theatrical spirit gum, and, most damningly, several meticulously crafted prosthetic pieces, a thin nose bridge, subtle cheekbone contours, even a small chin implant. The tools of a master of disguise. Edmund Swetnam wasn't just Emil Langer. He was actively prepared to become someone else. Her eyes scanned the room further. A half-packed traveling bag lay open on the bed. Inside were changes of clothing, a passport in the name of Edmund Swetnam, and a thick envelope stuffed with cash, British pounds and Swiss francs. He was ready to run. But why now? Because Charlotte had confessed? Because the net was closing? A faint sound from the hallway, Craddock's voice, deeper now, moving away from Charlotte's door. Time was running out. Miss Marple's gaze fell back on the desk. Tucked under the forger's portfolio was a small black-bound notebook. She opened it. It wasn't poetry. It was a ledger. Entries dated back several months. Payments received from H. Henderson, marked retainer. Information fee. Silencing bonus. Payments made out to R.S. Rudi Scherz, marked distraction fee. Final payment. And a recent large payment marked EV, elimination. Eleanor Vane. The cold clinical entries detailed the entire operation. The blackmail of Charlotte, the hiring of Scherz to create chaos at Little Paddocks, with the explicit note, "Ensure S becomes casualty, collateral damage acceptable." The murder of Mrs. Vane to retrieve the letter. It was a confession written in ink and numbers. She heard footsteps approaching the door. Heavy, purposeful footsteps. Craddock's? Coming to check on Swetnam, or Swetnam himself, returning? There was no time to replace everything perfectly. She snatched the ledger, the prosthetic case, and the photograph of Langer, shoving them into her large knitting bag. She slipped out of the room, silently pulling the door closed, just as the footsteps reached the landing. She flattened herself against the wall beside Charlotte's door. It was Edmund Swetnam. He moved with a predatory grace that belied his usual languid posture. He didn't glance toward Charlotte's room. His focus was entirely on his own door. He unlocked it swiftly and slipped inside, closing it softly behind him. Miss Marple didn't wait. She moved quickly down the stairs, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had the proof. Now she needed Craddock. She found the inspector in the small parlor off the hall, speaking into a telephone. He looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. "Miss Marple, everything all right?" "No, Inspector," she said, her voice low and urgent. She opened her knitting bag.
Everything is far from all right. I have what you need, the proof, the how." Craddock ended his call abruptly, his eyes widening as she laid the ledger, the prosthetic case, and the photograph of Emil Langer on the table. "Good God," he breathed, picking up the ledger. His face hardened as he scanned the entries. Payments to Scherz, elimination of EV. This is the operational ledger of the entire conspiracy. "The tools of his trade, Inspector," Miss Marple said, indicating the prosthetics. "He wasn't just observing. He was prepared to disappear, to become someone else entirely. And this," she tapped the photograph, "is Edmund Swetnam, or rather Emil Langer, the blackmailer, the man pulling Henderson's strings, the man who murdered Rudi Scherz and Eleanor Vane." Craddock's jaw tightened. He picked up the prosthetic nosepiece, turning it over in his hand. "He's been here all along, under our noses, writing poetry, playing the detached intellectual." He looked towards the door, towards the stairs. "He's still up there. We move now, quietly." They ascended the stairs, two constables falling silently into step behind them. The atmosphere on the landing was electric. Craddock nodded to the constables, who positioned themselves on either side of Swetnam's door. Craddock knocked firmly. "Mr. Swetnam, Inspector Craddock, open up, please. We need to speak with you." Silence. Then the sound of a drawer sliding open, the rustle of paper. Craddock knocked again, louder. "Mr. Swetnam, open this door immediately." A shot rang out, muffled but distinct, from within the room. The sound of shattering glass. Craddock didn't hesitate. "Break it down." The constable slammed into the door. It splintered open. They rushed inside, Craddock on his heels. Miss Marple remained on the landing, her heart in her throat. The room was in chaos. The window overlooking the back garden was shattered, curtains billowing in the breeze. Edmund Swetnam stood in the center of the room, a small, sleek pistol held loosely in his hand. His face, usually a mask of bored detachment, was contorted with fury and desperation. The traveling bag lay open on the bed, its contents spilling out. He'd been interrupted mid-escape. "Drop it, Swetnam, or should I say Langer?" Craddock commanded, his own weapon drawn and steady. Swetnam, Langer, laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of humor. He didn't drop the gun. "Clever, Inspector, very clever. Sending the old lady to do your dirty work. Did she enjoy rummaging through my things?" His eyes, cooled and reptilian, flicked towards Miss Marple in the doorway. "You should have left well enough alone, you meddling old crone. This was never your concern." "Murder is always everyone's concern, Mr. Langer, especially when it involves vulnerable women like Charlotte Girdler and Eleanor Vane."
"Vulnerable," Langer sneered. "Charlotte Girdler is a fraud, a thief living off a lie. She stole that fortune. It was never rightfully hers. And Eleanor Vane was a sentimental fool who couldn't keep her mouth shut. They both got what they deserved." He gestured with the gun towards the open window. "Now I'm leaving. Try to stop me, and I'll take one of you with me. I've nothing left to lose." "On the contrary, Mr. Langer," Craddock said, taking a step forward, his voice ice-cold. "You have your freedom left. Drop the weapon. Come quietly. It's over." "Over?" Langer's laugh was sharper this time, edged with hysteria. "It's never over. Not until the last secret is buried." He raised the pistol, aiming it not at Craddock, but at Miss Marple. A flicker of pure, unadulterated hatred crossed his face. "You should have died with the others, old woman." Before he could pull the trigger, a blur of motion erupted from the doorway behind Miss Marple. Julia Simmons, drawn by the commotion, lunged forward with a cry of rage. She wasn't aiming for Langer. She was aiming for the gun. She crashed into his arm, spoiling his aim. The shot went wide, embedding itself in the wall beside Miss Marple's head. Langer roared in fury and pain, stumbling back.
Craddock and the constables were on him in an instant. The pistol was knocked from his grasp, skittering across the floorboards. He struggled violently, spitting curses, but he was outnumbered and disarmed. Within seconds, he was face down on the floor, wrists handcuffed tightly behind his back. As Craddock hauled the snarling, defeated man to his feet, Miss Marple's gaze met Julia's. The young woman was trembling, her face pale but resolute. "He was going to shoot you," Julia whispered, her voice shaking. "After everything, after Aunt Charlotte, after Mrs. Vane. I couldn't let him."
Miss Marple reached out and squeezed Julia's hand. "You were very brave, my dear, very brave indeed." Craddock marched the struggling Langer towards the door. "Emil Langer, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murders of Rudi Scherz and Eleanor Vane, conspiracy to commit fraud, blackmail, and attempted murder. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." Langer glared back over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Miss Marple's. "This isn't the end, old woman," he hissed, his voice dripping venom. "The web is bigger than you know. Henderson is still out there, and he knows everything." He was dragged from the room, his threats echoing down the stairs. Silence descended, broken only by Julia's ragged breathing and the distant wail of a police siren approaching. Miss Marple walked slowly to the shattered window, looking out at the peaceful, sun-drenched garden of Little Paddocks. The immediate threat was contained. Emil Langer, the spider at the center of the web of deceit and murder, was in custody. The proof of his crimes, the ledger, the tools of disguise, the photograph lay irrefutably on the desk. Charlotte's secret was exposed, her identity as a fraud confirmed. The mystery of the murder announcement, the deaths of Scherz and Mrs. Vane, was solved. Yet Langer's final words hung in the air like a toxic miasma. Henderson is still out there, and he knows everything. The capture of Langer was a victory, but it wasn't the end. Henderson, the ruthless fixer, the man who handled the money, who recruited Scherz, who likely carried out the actual killing of Mrs. Vane, remained at large. He was the loose thread, the silent partner who could still unravel everything, who might still pose a danger to Charlotte, to Mitzi, to anyone else who knew too much. Miss Marple picked up the discarded prosthetic nosepiece from the floor where it had fallen during the struggle. It felt cold and alien in her palm, a symbol of the elaborate lie Langer had constructed, the identity he had worn like a mask in their midst. They had unmasked the impostor, but the shadow of his accomplice stretched long and dark over the village. The chapter closed not with triumph, but with the chilling certainty that the hunk was far from over. Henderson was still out there, watching, waiting. And Miss Marple knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he would not simply disappear. He would act, and soon. The storm had only paused. It had not passed.
Chapter 7. The Second Victim. The arrest of Emil Langer should have brought a measure of relief to St. Mary Mead, but instead it cast the village into a state of watchful anxiety. Little Paddocks, now a known hub of fraud and murder, stood shuttered and silent under police guard, a grim monument to secrets unearthed. Inspector Craddock, though buoyed by the capture of the blackmailer, was visibly strained. Langer had clammed up in custody, refusing to name Henderson or reveal his accomplice's whereabouts. The net had caught the spider, but the venomous fly that had done the biting remained free, buzzing ominously just beyond reach. Miss Jane Marple felt this unease acutely. She spent the morning after Langer's arrest in her garden, the rhythmic click of her knitting needles a counterpoint to the frantic buzzing of her thoughts. The pattern was simple, a baby shawl for a village newcomer, but her mind was navigating a labyrinth far more complex. Henderson was the key. ruthless, efficient, and utterly invisible. He'd arranged Scherz's death, likely murdered Eleanor Vane, and now, with his employer exposed, he would be desperate. Desperate men were dangerous men, and Charlotte Godler, still confined to Little Paddocks under Craddock's protective custody, remained his most valuable target or his most dangerous liability. Her contemplation was interrupted by the frantic arrival of Dolly Bantry, her usually cheerful face flushed with alarm. "Jane! Jane! It's awful! Simply awful! They've taken Miss Bunner to the hospital. She's been poisoned!" Miss Marple's needles froze mid-stitch. "Miss Bunner? Poisoned? How? When?" "At Little Paddocks," Dolly gasped, sinking onto the garden bench beside her. "Just this morning, a box of chocolates arrived. Fancy ones, Swiss chocolates. Addressed to Miss Blacklock. Charlotte, I suppose. Miss Bunner, bless her heart, thought they were a peace offering after all the trouble. She opened them, had one, and collapsed. Dr. Haydock was there already, checking on Charlotte. He says it's some kind of poison, fast-acting, nasty stuff. They rushed her to Chipping Cleghorn General, but it doesn't look good, Jane. It doesn't look good at all." Swiss chocolates, delivered to Little Paddocks. The timing was exquisite, the symbolism brutal. A direct message from Henderson, perhaps? Or a cruel coincidence? Miss Marple doubted it. "Who else was there, Dolly? Who handled the box?" "Just Miss Bunner and Charlotte, I think. And Mitzi, of course. She was hysterical when I left. Craddock's tearing his hair out. The house is locked down tighter than ever. But the chocolates, they just appeared. On the front step. No note, nothing." Miss Marple carefully set down her knitting. "I need to go to Little Paddocks, now." The atmosphere at Little Paddocks was thick with fear and the acrid tang of medical emergency. Dr. Haydock's car was still outside, and a police constable stood rigidly by the front door, looking grim. Inside, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Inspector Craddock was questioning a white-faced Mitzi in the hallway, his voice tight with frustration. Charlotte Godler sat in the parlor, slumped in an armchair, her face ashen, her hands twisting a handkerchief. On a small, occasional table beside her lay the source of the horror, an elegant dark blue box tied with a silver ribbon. The lid was open, revealing a bed of velvet lining and a half-dozen chocolates, one clearly missing. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, looking up as she entered. His relief at her arrival was palpable. "Thank goodness, Mitzi isn't making much sense. She found the box on the step this morning, brought it in. Miss Bunner opened it, thought they were for Charlotte, helped herself, and collapsed within minutes." Miss Marple moved towards the table, her gaze sweeping the box, the chocolates, the immediate surroundings. "No note, no card." "Nothing," Craddock confirmed. "Just the box. Delivered by hand, obviously. Postman doesn't come until later. Constable on watch saw nothing unusual." Mitzi burst into fresh tears. "It is him, Henderson. He is punishing us because they caught Langer. He wants to kill Charlotte. Miss Bunner, she ate the poison meant for Charlotte." She pointed a trembling finger at the box. "The Swiss chocolates. It is a message from Switzerland, from him." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her attention fixed on the chocolates. She leaned closer, her sharp eyes examining them minutely. They were expensive-looking chocolates, individually molded with intricate swirls. She noted the missing one, a dark chocolate praline, the center visible where it had been bitten. The filling looked like a smooth, dark caramel. She also noted something else, the faintest residue of a whitish powder on the velvet lining near the empty space. "Dr. Haydock," she called softly. The doctor who had been conferring with another officer approached. "Doctor, what kind of poison was it? Do you know yet?" Haydock shook his head, his expression grim. "Too early for definitive tests, Miss Marple, but the symptoms were rapid. Severe abdominal cramps, vomiting, convulsions, respiratory distress. Points towards something fast-acting and highly toxic. possibly a concentrated alkaloid, aconite, or a synthetic like nicotine sulfate. Whatever it was meant to kill quickly and painfully. Miss Bunner, she's strong, but the dose, it was massive. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Massive and delivered with chilling precision. Not a random act, Doctor. A targeted strike. She turned to Charlotte. Mrs. Godler, did you order these chocolates? Expect any delivery? Charlotte looked utterly bewildered and terrified. No, of course not. Why would I? After everything. Swiss chocolates. She shuddered. It's him, Henderson. He knows I'm here. He knows I'm talking. He's sending a message. And poor dear Dora, she just loved chocolates. She thought they were a treat. Her voice broke. Mitzi wailed. I told her not to. I said it was strange, but she laughed. She said, Mitzi, don't be silly. Who would poison chocolates? Oh, God, she is dying because of me, because of us. Craddock stepped in. Mitzi, calm down. We need facts. Who exactly handled the box before Miss Bunner opened it? Only me, Mitzi sobbed. I brought it in from the step. I put it on the hall table. Then Miss Bunner saw it. She picked it up, brought it in here, put it on that table, opened it, looked inside, said, Ooh, Swiss, how lovely. Then she took one, just one, and dissolved into incoherent weeping. Miss Marple's mind was racing. The box appeared on the step. Mitzi brought it in. Miss Bunner handled it, opened it, consumed one chocolate. No one else touched it. The poison was clearly in that specific chocolate. But how? The chocolates looked pristine. The poison must have been introduced after manufacture, likely injected into the filling. That required access and knowledge. Henderson or an agent had delivered the box personally. But how did they know Miss Bunner would be the one to open it? Or was she simply the first victim, with Charlotte the intended target all along? The message was clear. No one in Little Paddocks was safe.
Inspector, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but urgent, I need to examine Miss Bunner's room and the hallway table where the box was first placed. Craddock nodded. Of course. Constable, accompany Miss Marple. Miss Bunner's room was small, neat, and smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. It reflected its occupant, quiet, unassuming, slightly fussy. Miss Marple scanned the surfaces, a hairbrush, a novel, a glass of water. Nothing unusual. She opened the drawers, neatly folded blouses, stockings, handkerchiefs. Nothing. She checked under the bed, behind the wardrobe. Dust bunnies, a lost button. Nothing. She moved to the hallway table. It was a small, polished mahogany table with a single drawer. Miss Marple opened it. Inside were a few stray buttons, some unused notepaper, a pencil, and a small leather-bound address book. She picked up the address book. It was old, the cover worn. She flipped through it. Names and addresses, mostly local, but tucked into the back cover was a folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it. It wasn't an address. It was a list. Written in Miss Bunner's neat, precise hand were several entries, dated over the past few weeks. LB Financials, check bank statements, attic desk. Mitzi, Switzerland, overheard talking to Mrs. Vane. ES, poetry or maps, room always locked, suspicious. Henderson, P. Simmons mention name, pressure on LB. The switch, Belle or Charlotte, Mrs. Vane insisted. Proof. Miss Marple's breath caught. Miss Bunner hadn't just been a companion, she'd been an investigator, Quietly, methodically, she'd been observing, questioning, digging into the very secrets that had led to murder. She'd noted the financial pressure on Charlotte, referencing the attic desk Miss Marple had found, suspected Mitzi knew more about Switzerland, found Edmund Swettenham's locked room suspicious, connected Henderson to Patrick Simmons, and crucially, had noted Mrs. Vane's insistence on the switch and the existence of proof. Miss Bunner knew, or at least she knew enough to be dangerous, and now she was dying. "Did you find something, Miss Marple?" Craddock asked, appearing in the hallway. Miss Marple handed him the list. Miss Bunner wasn't merely a bystander, Inspector. She was conducting her own inquiry. She knew about the financial troubles, Mitzi's potential knowledge, Swettenham's secrecy, Henderson, and the core secret of the switch. She was looking for proof Mrs. Vane claimed to have. Craddock scanned the list, his expression hardening. Good God! She was putting the pieces together herself. No wonder Henderson targeted her, silencing her before she could talk to us or before she found whatever proof Mrs. Vane had. He looked towards the parlor where Charlotte sat. And the chocolates, delivered to Charlotte, but Miss Bunner intercepted them. Was it bad luck for Henderson, or was Miss Bunner the primary target all along? She was becoming a direct threat. Either way, the message is sent, Miss Marple said grimly. Henderson is watching. He knows we're close, and he's escalating. Later that afternoon, the grim news came from the hospital. Miss Dora Bunner had succumbed to the poison. Little Paddocks had claimed its second victim. The village, already reeling, was plunged into deeper shock and fear. The sanctuary of home had become a death trap. That evening, under the guise of offering comfort to the devastated household, though Craddock had initially resisted, Miss Marple's quiet insistence and the need for her unique perspective won out. Miss Marple returned to Little Paddocks. The house felt haunted, the silence heavy with grief and terror. Charlotte was sedated, resting in her room. Julia sat with her, pale and silent. Mitzi was confined to the kitchen, watched by a policewoman. Patrick Simmons had returned, looking grim and angry, vowing revenge on Henderson if he ever found him. Miss Marple asked to see Miss Bunner's room again. Craddock, seeing the purpose in her eyes, accompanied her. "What are you looking for, Miss Marple? We've been over it." "The proof, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. "The proof Mrs. Vane had. The proof Miss Bunner was seeking. Mrs. Vane said, 'Look in the place where the old stories are kept.' We found the letter in the church vestry, but was that the only proof? Or was there something else, something Miss Bunner found?" She began a meticulous search of the room again, this time focusing on items Miss Bunner used daily. She examined the hairbrush on the nightstand. A cheap romance. She flicked through the pages. Nothing. She picked up the hairbrush. Clean. She looked at the glass of water, untouched since the morning.
Her gaze fell upon Miss Bunner's sewing basket, sitting in a corner by the window. It was a large wicker basket, overflowing with fabrics, threads, scissors, and half-finished mending. Miss Marple knelt beside it. She began to carefully remove the items, piece by piece. Scraps of floral cotton, balls of wool, a thimble, a tape measure, a small pincushion shaped like a tomato. She lifted the pincushion. It felt slightly heavier than it should. She squeezed it gently. Something hard shifted inside. Using a small pair of embroidery scissors from the basket, Miss Marple carefully unpicked a seam along the bottom of the pincushion. She reached inside and pulled out a small, tightly folded piece of oilskin. Unfolding it, she revealed a single, yellowed sheet of paper. It was covered in the same elegant handwriting as Belle Godler's deathbed letter. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. Deed to Chalet Les Alpes, Montreux, safe deposit box, Credit Suisse, Genet, key with LB.
Bank statements, accounts 1, 3, 7, Henderson payments, traced. Photographs, Belle and Charlotte, originals, desk drawer. Correspondence, Hesmer extortion, burned, see notes. Swiss residence permit, Letitia Blacklock, filed, study cabinet. Proof of switch, letter from Belle to Charlotte, dated 14th May 1947, original destroyed. Copy? Miss Marple's heart gave a steady, heavy beat. This was it, Mrs. Vane's proof, not just the deathbed letter, but a comprehensive inventory of the Godler secrets, the financial trail, the forged documents, and, crucially, a note about the original Belle letter being destroyed, but the existence of a copy. Mrs. Vane hadn't just known the switch happened, she had documented the mechanics of it. This list was the roadmap to Charlotte's entire deception. And Miss Bunner had found it hidden in her sewing basket, the place where old stories, woven in thread and fabric, were literally kept. Incredible, Craddock breathed, looking over her shoulder. She had it all, the financials, the paper trail, the proof of the switch. No wonder Henderson silenced her. This list, it's the key to unraveling everything Charlotte built. It exposes every lie. And it names Henderson's payments, Miss Marple added, pointing to the relevant line, traced. If we can access those bank statements, we will, Craddock vowed. With this, we have grounds for a full forensic audit. Henderson's financial trail won't stay hidden for long. He carefully took the oilskin packet. This changes everything, Miss Marple. We have the motive, the means, and now the irrefutable evidence of the fraud. Charlotte, she'll have to face the consequences. But more importantly, he looked towards the door, his expression hardening. This list is the death warrant for Henderson's operation. He can't afford to let this see the light of day. He'll know Miss Bunner had it. He'll know we have it now. He'll make one last desperate play. As if summoned by his words, the lights in the hallway flickered violently, then plunged into darkness. Simultaneously, the sound of shattering glass erupted from the back of the house, the kitchen. "Mitzi!" Yulia screamed from Charlotte's room. Craddock snapped into action, drawing his revolver. "Stay here, Miss Marple. Constable, with me." He and the officer raced towards the kitchen and the source of the commotion. Miss Marple, however, didn't stay. She moved silently but swiftly towards the front of the house, towards the source of the power cut. The fuse box was located in a small cupboard under the main staircase. As she approached, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows beside the staircase. He was tall, powerfully built, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the gloom. His face was partially obscured, but Miss Marple recognized the cold, hard eyes immediately from Throgmorton's description. Henderson. He hadn't fled. He'd come for the list. He moved with the speed and silence of a predator, lunging not towards Miss Marple, but towards the parlor where Craddock had left the oilskin packet on the table. Miss Marple acted on instinct. She snatched up a heavy brass candlestick from the hall table and swung it with surprising force, not at Henderson, but at the porcelain vase beside him. It shattered with a deafening crash. Henderson flinched, startled by the noise, his head whipping towards her. His eyes, cold and murderous, locked onto hers. "You meddling old bitch," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He abandoned his lunge for the parlor and turned his full attention to her. He was fast, covering the distance between them in 2 strides. One hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with crushing force, wrenching the candlestick from her grasp. The other hand went to his belt, producing a long, thin-bladed knife that glinted wickedly in the faint moonlight filtering through the front door window. "Where is it?" he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath foul. "The inspector has it, Mr. Henderson. It's over. Your employer is in custody. Your financial trail is exposed. There's nowhere left to run." Henderson's face contorted with fury. Langer was a fool. I always have contingencies. He tightened the grip on the knife, raising it slightly. "But you're a loose end I should have tied off weeks ago. Pity." He began to press the knife towards her throat. From the kitchen, the sounds of struggle grew louder. Shouts, a crash, the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Craddock and the constable were engaged with someone, likely an accomplice Henderson had brought. They were distracted. Miss Marple was alone. She didn't struggle against his grip on her wrist.
Instead, she used her free hand, moving with the speed of a striking snake. She drove her thumb, hardened by years of gardening and knitting, directly into Henderson's eye with all her strength. He roared in pain and surprise, staggering back, instinctively dropping the knife and clutching his face. Miss Marple wrenched her wrist free, stumbling backwards towards the parlor door. She grabbed the oilskin packet from the table where Craddock had left it. Henderson recovered quickly, his one good eye blazing with murderous intent. He lunged for her again, ignoring the knife, intent on overpowering her. Miss Marple scrambled backwards into the parlor, fumbling for the door handle. Henderson was on her, his hands closing around her throat, squeezing with terrifying force. Black spots danced before her eyes. She could smell his sweat, feel his rage. The oilskin packet slipped from her grasp, but a fluttering to the floor. Just as darkness threatened to consume her, a figure exploded into the room from the kitchen doorway. It was Yulia. Her face was a mask of fury and terror. She held a heavy iron fireplace poker in both hands. With a scream of pure rage, she swung it like a baseball bat, connecting with devastating force against the side of Henderson's head. The sound was sickening, a dull, wet thud. Henderson's grip on Miss Marple's throat vanished instantly. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed like a felled tree, hitting the floor with a heavy thud, unmoving. Yulia stood over him, trembling violently, the poker still clutched in her hands, her chest heaving. Miss Marple sank to the keys, gasping for air. Her throat burning, her vision slowly clearing. Craddock burst into the room, followed by the dazed constable and a sobbing Mitzi. "Yulia!" Craddock exclaimed, taking in the scene. Miss Marple on the floor, gasping, Henderson unconscious, Yulia standing over him with the poker. "Are you all right, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple managed a nod, rubbing her bruised throat. He came for the list. Yulia saved me." Craddock quickly checked Henderson. "Out cold, probably a concussion. We'll need an ambulance." He looked at Yulia, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "That was incredibly brave, Miss Simmons. Incredibly foolish, but brave." Yulia dropped the poker with a clatter, her legs finally giving way. She sank to the floor beside Miss Marple, tears streaming down her face. "He was going to kill you. He was going to kill Miss Bunner. Like he killed Mrs. Vane. I just couldn't let him." Miss Marple reached out and placed a comforting hand on Yulia's shoulder. "You did what was necessary, my dear. You saved a life." She looked down at the oilskin packet lying beside Henderson's unconscious form. The list was safe. Henderson was captured. The immediate threat was neutralized. But as she looked at Henderson's still form, the bruise already purpling around Yulia's improvised weapon, and felt the raw pain in her own throat, Miss Marple knew the cost had been high. 2 women were dead. Charlotte's life was irrevocably shattered. Yulia had been forced to violence, and the peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead was gone forever, replaced by the grim reality of greed, betrayal, and murder. The web was finally broken, its deadliest occupants caught or dead. Yet the silence that fell over Little Paddocks in the aftermath wasn't peaceful. It was the hollow, echoing silence left by violence and loss. The chapter closed on the image of Miss Marple and Yulia huddled on the parlor floor, the list of secrets between them, the unconscious killer at their feet, and the heavy, inescapable weight of all that had been lost. The storm had passed, leaving devastation in its wake.
Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Gambit. The aftermath of Henderson's capture left Little Paddocks suspended in a state of exhausted limbo. The physical danger had passed, but the emotional and psychological wreckage was profound. The house, once a haven of quiet respectability, now felt like a tomb, its air thick with the scent of antiseptic, fear, and unresolved grief. Inspector Craddock, though visibly relieved at the removal of the immediate threat, was burdened by the mountain of evidence and the complex legal entanglements ahead. Charlotte Goodler, sedated and under close guard, was a shadow of the woman the village had known, her carefully constructed identity shattered beyond repair. Julia Simmons moved like a ghost, haunted by the violence she had witnessed and perpetrated.
Patrick Simmons paced like a caged animal, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Mitzi, when not weeping, retreated into a catatonic silence. Miss Jane Marple, however, felt the familiar, unwelcome stirrings of resolve. The immediate predators, Langer and Henderson, were caged, but the hunt wasn't truly over. The why of it all, the intricate tapestry of motives and mistakes that had led to 3 deaths, remained partially obscured. Craddock had the evidence, the forged documents, the financial trails, the deathbed letter, Miss Bunner's devastating list. He could build a case against Charlotte for fraud and potentially against Langer and Henderson for murder. But Miss Marple sensed something deeper, a crucial thread still dangling. The murder announcement itself, its specific timing, its public nature, felt overly elaborate, almost theatrical from mere cover. And Miss Bunner's death by poisoned chocolates, while Henderson had delivered them, the idea felt personal, laced with a bitterness that went beyond simple silencing. Someone else had a stake in this, someone still hidden within the fragile circle of survivors. Her mind kept returning to the list Miss Bunner had compiled. The switch, Belle/Charlotte. Mrs. Vane insisted, proof? Miss Bunner had been looking for proof. She'd found the inventory list hidden in her sewing basket, but had she found something else? Something more personal? Something that pointed not just to the fact of the switch, but to the motive behind Belle's desperate act. Belle's letter spoke of protecting Charlotte from shadows and certain elements. But what if those shadows were closer than Hesmer? What if the threat was more intimate? Dolly Bantry arrived the next morning bearing a basket of scones and a faceful of anxious curiosity. "Jane, the village is abuzz. Henderson caught, Julia a heroine, though she looks absolutely dreadful, poor thing. And Charlotte, well, they say she hasn't spoken a word since they took Henderson away. What happens now? Will they arrest her?" "Eventually, Dolly," Miss Marple murmured, accepting the scones. "The fraud is undeniable, but there are loose ends, threads that need pulling before the pattern is truly clear." She paused, her gaze distant. "I need to speak to everyone together, Dolly, here, at Little Paddocks, tonight." "Tonight? Jane, are you mad? After everything? The place is practically a crime scene museum." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, a faint, determined smile touching her lips. "It's the only place where the truth still resonates, where the memories are fresh. I need to lay out the pieces, Dolly, not just for Craddock, but for them, to see who flinches, to see who understands." She explained her plan, a gathering, ostensibly for Craddock, to outline the next steps and offer some closure to the household. But Miss Marple's true purpose was far more subtle and far more dangerous. She intended to set a trap, not for a killer, but for a truth. Dolly, ever game for intrigue, despite her nerves, agreed to help. "I'll bake a cake, a very large, very distracting cake. What kind? Victoria sponge? Lemon drizzle?" "Chocolate, I think, Dolly," Miss Marple said softly. "Rich, dark, something to match the mood."
Charlotte nodded mutely, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was the moment Miss Marple had been waiting for. The official narrative was laid out. The designated villains were named. Now, to probe the shadows. She cleared her throat softly, the sound cutting through the heavy silence like a small bell. "A most thorough summary, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but carrying clearly. "You have untangled the outer layers of this most tragic web with remarkable skill. The how and the who of the murders are, it seems, largely resolved." She paused, letting her gaze drift slowly over each person in the room. Charlotte, Julia, Patrick, Mitzi, Dr. Haydock. But the why, the deepest why, that, I believe, still holds a shadow. A shadow cast not by Hesmer or Langer, or Henderson, but by something much closer to home. By love, perhaps, or by the absence of it. All eyes turned to her. Craddock looked intrigued, slightly wary. The others stared, confused. Miss Bunner was a remarkable woman, Miss Marple continued, picking up her knitting needles, the soft click-click a soothing counterpoint to the tension. Quiet, observant. She saw more than anyone gave her credit for. She didn't just uncover the fact of the switch. She was searching for the reason Belle Goodler felt compelled to orchestrate such a desperate deception. She noted the switch, Belle/Charlotte, Mrs. Vane insisted, proof. Proof of the switch, yes, but proof of what necessitated it. She leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes sharp and perceptive. Belle's letter spoke of protecting Charlotte from shadows and certain elements connected to the family's past. Hesmer, the blackmailer. But what if there was another shadow? A shadow within the Goodler family itself? What if the threat wasn't just external, but internal? What if Belle wasn't just protecting Charlotte from the world, but from someone closer? She looked directly at Charlotte. Mrs. Goodler, Charlotte, you loved your sister deeply, I think, but was it entirely reciprocated, or was there resentment, bitterness? Belle was the elder sister, the heiress, the one who lived fully. You were the delicate one, confined, hidden. Did Belle perhaps feel burdened by you? Did she, consciously or unconsciously, make you feel less? Charlotte flinched violently, her head snapping up. Her eyes, filled with pain and shock, met Miss Marple's. No, Belle loved me. She saved me. Saved you from what, Charlotte? Miss Marple pressed gently. From Hesmer or from something else? From a life where you would always be in her shadow? Where her wealth, her position, her very existence defined your limitations? Miss Marple's gaze shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, towards Julia Simmons. Belle created a new identity for you, Letitia Blacklock, a companion, independent, free. But it was a freedom built on Belle's death, on erasing Charlotte Goodler entirely. Was that truly a gift, or was it perhaps a way for Belle to finally be free of the responsibility, of the constant reminder of her sister's fragility? Charlotte's breath hitched. No, it wasn't like that. Wasn't it? Miss Marple's voice was still soft, but it carried an undeniable weight. Consider the timing. Belle made the switch, destroyed the original will naming you as heir, created the new will leaving everything to Miss Blacklock. Then she died. You became Letitia Blacklock, inheriting everything. Belle ensured you were provided for, yes, but she also ensured that Charlotte Goodler ceased to exist, that the burden, the reminder, was gone, forever. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, thick with implication. She saw Julia Simmons shift uncomfortably in her seat, her hands twisting in her lap. Patrick looked confused, then suddenly thoughtful. Mitzi stared, wide-eyed. Miss Bunner found more than just the inventory list. Miss Marple continued, her gaze now fixed on Julia. She found something else, something hidden away, something personal, a diary perhaps, or letters, not from Belle to Charlotte, but from Charlotte to Belle. Letters written during those long years in the sanatorium, letters filled not just with love, but with resentment, with anger at being hidden away, with accusations that Belle didn't truly understand her suffering, that Belle pitied her. Julia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her face went deathly pale.
She stared at Miss Marple, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Miss Marple nodded slowly, confirming Julia's unspoken fear. "Yes, my dear, I think Miss Bunner found those letters. Letters that painted a different picture, not of a devoted sister saving a fragile one, but of a complex relationship fraught with unspoken bitterness. Letters that suggested Belle's act, while born of love, was also tinged with a profound selfishness, a desire to be free of the weight of her sister's needs and the constant shadow of her fragility. Letters that proved the switch wasn't just protection, it was an escape for Belle." She turned back to Charlotte. "And you, Charlotte, you lived the life Belle gave you. You became Letitia Blacklock. But you carried the secret and the guilt. Not just the guilt of the fraud, but the guilt of knowing the complex, painful truth behind your sister's sacrifice. That it wasn't purely altruistic, that it freed her as much as it saved you." Charlotte was trembling violently now, tears streaming down her face. "She loved me," she whispered brokenly. "She did, but yes, there were times. I was so angry, so alone. I wrote things, terrible things, in the sanatorium. I burned them. I thought I burned them all." "But you didn't, did you?" Miss Marple said softly. "Belle kept them, perhaps as a penance, perhaps as a reminder. And Miss Bunner found them. She found those letters. She understood the true, painful complexity of the switch. And she knew, Charlotte, that if those letters ever came to light, they wouldn't just expose the fraud, they would expose the raw, painful truth about your relationship with Belle. They would shatter the image of the devoted sister. They would reveal the bitterness, the resentment, the guilt that lay beneath the surface of your new life." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, finally resting on Julia with profound sadness. And someone else knew about those letters. Someone who had found them before Miss Bunner. Someone who understood their devastating potential. Someone who had a vested interest in protecting the myth of Belle's selfless sacrifice. Someone who saw Charlotte not as a victim, but a living reminder of that messy reality.
Julia Simmons stood up, her face a mask of anguish and fury. "Stop it! Just stop it! You don't know anything! You're twisting everything!" "Don't I, Julia?" Miss Marple asked, her voice still gentle, but now laced with steel. "You're Belle Goodler's great niece, aren't you? Not a distant cousin, as everyone believed. Her sister's grandchild. You idolized her. You heard the stories of her kindness, her generosity. You came to Little Paddocks not just as Patrick's relation, but seeking a connection to the legendary Belle. And you found Charlotte, living Belle's life on Belle's money. But you also found hints, whispers, Mitzi's ramblings about Switzerland, Mrs. Vane's knowing looks. You started digging, didn't you? You found Charlotte's old letters to Belle, hidden away. You read them. You saw the bitterness, the anger. You saw the truth behind the switch, and it shattered your image of Belle." Julia swayed, her face crumpling. "She wasn't like that. She couldn't be." "But she was, Julia," Miss Marple said with quiet compassion. "She was human, flawed. Her love for Charlotte was real, but so was her burden. The letters proved it. And you couldn't bear it. You couldn't bear the thought of the world knowing that your idol, Belle Goodler, had been capable of such complexity, such selfishness. You saw Charlotte not as the saved sister, but as the proof of Belle's imperfection, as a stain on her legacy." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Julia's. "So you decided to protect the myth. You contacted Langer. You didn't know his real name then, just that he was a blackmailer with connections to Switzerland. You fed him information about Charlotte's financial troubles, hinting at secrets worth exploiting. You encouraged him to pressure her, to push her towards the edge. You saw the murder announcement as an opportunity, chaos to cover the retrieval of the letters, or perhaps even Charlotte's death, removing the living proof forever. You manipulated Scherz through Henderson, knowing he'd be eliminated. You were horrified when Mrs. Vane was killed. You hadn't intended that, but it served your purpose by removing another witness. And Miss Bunner. Miss Marple's voice hardened. Miss Bunner found the letters after you did. She was going to expose everything, not just the fraud, but the truth about Belle. You couldn't let that happen. You knew Henderson was delivering the chocolates. You knew Miss Bunner's weakness for them. You ensured she was the one to find them, to open them. You used Henderson's weapon to silence the woman who threatened to destroy your idol's memory. You protected Belle's legacy with blood. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Julia's ragged sobs and Charlotte's quiet weeping. Patrick stared at his sister, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Craddock looked stunned, then grimly understanding, his hand moving subtly towards his constable. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Julia cried, her voice cracking with despair. I just wanted the truth to stay buried. For Belle's sake. For the family name. Charlotte, she didn't deserve the life Belle gave her. She resented it. She proved it with those letters. I had to protect... She broke down, collapsing back into her chair, burying her face in her hands. I killed Miss Bunner. I killed her. No, Julia, Miss Marple said softly, but with undeniable authority. You did not administer the poison. Henderson did, but you ensured she was the one to take it. You manipulated events to make her the target. You are as responsible for her death as if you'd held the chocolate to her lips yourself. And for Scherz, and for Mrs. Vane, through your actions with Langer. Your desire to protect a myth created monsters. Craddock stepped forward, his face grim. Julia Simmons, I am arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, specifically the murders of Rudi Scherz, Eleanor Vane, and Dora Bunner, and for perverting the course of justice. The constable moved to Julia's side. As the constable helped the sobbing, broken girl to her feet, Miss Marple looked at Charlotte. The older woman met her gaze, her eyes filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. The weight of decades of deception, of guilt, of loss, was etched into every line of her face. The myth of Belle's sacrifice was shattered. The truth in all its painful complexity lay exposed. The web was finally, completely unraveled. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles. The soft click-click resumed in the heavy silence. The gambit had worked. The deepest shadow, the one cast by misguided love and the desperate need to protect a fragile legacy, had been brought into the light. The cost had been terrible, but the truth, however painful, was finally free. The chapter closed on the image of Julia being led away, Charlotte weeping silently, and Miss Marple, the quiet architect of the revelation, her needles clicking softly. A solitary figure in the wreckage of secrets. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the bleak, honest landscape of consequence.